I poured my mother-in-law a glass of $200 Cabernet just before she handed me an invoice for $6,700 to live in my own penthouse. She smiled, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin, and told me it was time I paid my dues for being allowed into her prestigious family. I did not scream or cry. I simply looked at the piece of paper and prepared to drop a truth bomb that would leave her entirely destitute. Before I share how I dismantled my entitled in-laws piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind toxic family members exactly who they are messing with. The Sunday dinner was supposed to be a peaceful evening. The sun was just beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm golden glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown penthouse. I had spent all afternoon preparing a beautiful meal: honey bourbon glazed salmon, garlic roasted asparagus, and a wild rice pilaf. The dining room smelled incredible, and the custom white marble table was set perfectly with crystal glasses and polished silver. I am 32 years old, and I built my real estate development firm from absolutely nothing. But in the eyes of my husband Jamal and his mother Loretta, my success was just a cute little hobby compared to their supposed generational wealth. Loretta sat at the head of the table, a position she claimed the moment she walked through my front door. She wore a tailored emerald suit that she had probably put on a credit card she could barely afford to pay the minimum balance on. Across from her sat Jamal's sister Chloe, busy scrolling on her phone and picking at the salmon as if it were fast food. Jamal sat next to me, quietly sipping his wine, completely oblivious to the tension radiating from his mother. Or so I thought. Halfway through the meal, Loretta pushed her plate of half-eaten salmon aside, with a deliberate scrape against the marble. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, cream-colored envelope. She did not say a word at first. She just slid it across the smooth surface of the table until it stopped right next to my wine glass. I looked at the envelope, then up at her. Her face was set in an expression of supreme entitlement, chin-raised lips pursed into a tight, patronizing smile. "Open it, Maya," she instructed, her tone suggesting she was giving me a gift. I picked up the envelope. It had the words "Sterling Family Trust" printed in bold, embossed letters at the top. I pulled out the single sheet of heavy cardstock inside. It was an invoice. A literal itemized bill addressed to me, demanding the sum of $6,700 payable on the first of every month. The description line simply read "monthly residential contribution." I stared at the numbers, my brain struggling to process the sheer audacity of what I was holding. I looked back at Loretta, waiting for the punchline. I waited for her to laugh, for Jamal to chuckle, for someone to tell me this was a bizarre prank. But the dining room was dead silent. There was no punchline. "What exactly is this, Loretta?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously calm and even. Loretta folded her hands on the table and leaned forward. "It is exactly what it looks like, Maya. It is your rent invoice. You have been living in this beautiful penthouse for 2 years now, since you and Jamal got married. Jamal brought you into this family, and we have welcomed you with open arms. But the Sterling family legacy requires maintenance. The trust owns this building, and it is only fair that you start paying your share to reside in a Sterling property. $6,700 is actually a steep discount for this square footage. You should consider yourself lucky." I slowly shifted my gaze to Jamal. My husband, the man who was supposed to be my partner, suddenly found his wine glass absolutely fascinating. He would not meet my eyes. He just cleared his throat and muttered, "Mom makes a good point, Maya. We all have to do our part for the family portfolio." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, but I refused to let them see me bleed. For years I had dealt with the strong black woman stereotype being weaponized against me. Because I was capable, because I was resilient, everyone assumed I could just carry the weight of their burdens without breaking a sweat. Loretta always looked down on my background, whispering about how I grew up on the wrong side of town, while bragging about her grandfather who supposedly founded a bank. She loved to play the part of the wealthy matriarch, hosting charity galas and wearing pearls, but I was the one working 70-hour weeks to build actual tangible wealth. "You want me to pay rent?" I repeated, making sure I enunciated every single syllable. You want me to pay $6,700 a month to the Sterling Family Trust. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes and scoffing. Do not act like you cannot afford it, Maya. We all know your little real estate flips are bringing in cash. Jamal elevated your whole life by giving you his last name. The least you can do is contribute to the estate. It is just business. I looked back down at the piece of paper. The Sterling Family Trust. A trust that, to my extensive professional knowledge, had been bankrupt for over a decade. A trust that certainly did not own the multi-million-dollar high-rise building we were currently sitting in. Let me make sure I understand this perfectly, I said, setting the paper down and folding my hands in my lap. You are telling me that the Sterling family owns this entire high-rise. And because Jamal married me, I am now obligated as a tenant to pay you rent to live in my own home. Loretta smiled, a smug, self-satisfied expression that made my blood boil. Exactly, dear. It is just how generational wealth operates. I know you are new to having money, so you might not understand the complexities of asset management. But this is how we protect our legacy. We expect the first payment transferred by Friday. I sat there in the quiet luxury of the penthouse I had purchased with my own blood, sweat, and tears 3 years before I ever even met her son. I looked at the imported chandelier above us, the custom hardwood floors beneath our feet, and the panoramic view of the city that I had negotiated for months to secure. I had the deed to this property locked in a safe in my home office entirely in my maiden name. Jamal had never contributed a single dime to the mortgage, the property taxes, or even the utility bills, claiming his startup company was just going through a rough patch. I had funded his lifestyle, cooked his meals, and tolerated his family's endless condescension because I believed in love and support. I had stayed silent when Loretta made passive-aggressive comments about my natural hair, and I had bit my tongue when she criticized my cooking for not being refined enough. But looking at the fake invoice sitting on my marble table, the illusion shattered completely. They did not just view me as beneath them, they viewed me as an ATM, an ignorant, gullible bank account they could drain to fund their delusions of grandeur. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of the Cabernet. The rich, dark liquid tasted like victory. I set the glass down, picked up the invoice, and ripped it straight down the middle. Loretta gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Excuse me," she sputtered, her eyes wide with manufactured outrage. "What on earth do you think you are doing?" "I am rejecting your invoice, Loretta," I said, maintaining direct eye contact as I tore the heavy cardstock into quarters. And while we are on the topic of asset management and real estate, I think it is time we have a very transparent conversation about who exactly owns what in this family. Because you see, Loretta, there is a fundamental flaw in your little extortion plan. The room grew impossibly quiet. The sound of the city traffic far below was the only noise breaking the heavy silence. Jamal finally looked up, his face pale, realizing that the docile, accommodating wife he thought he knew was gone, replaced by the shark who had conquered the Atlanta real estate market. I was about to teach them a masterclass in property ownership, and class was officially in session. The sound of the thick paper tearing was incredibly loud in the quiet dining room. The two halves of Loretta's ridiculous invoice fluttered down onto the pristine marble resting right next to the wild rice pilaf. Loretta stared at the pieces as if I had just taken a sledgehammer to a sacred artifact. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she could find her voice. But before she could start her inevitable theatrical performance, Jamal finally decided to join the conversation. I turned my head slightly, fully expecting my husband to do the right thing. I expected him to look at his mother, tell her the joke had gone far enough, and apologize to me for her delusional behavior. I expected the man I had married to stand up and defend his wife in her own home. Instead, Jamal took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. He carefully set the glass down, adjusted his cuffs, and looked everywhere in the room except at my face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, laced with an irritation that was entirely directed at me. "Maya, there is no need to be disrespectful," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably in his custom-upholstered chair. "My mother is just trying to establish some order. It is only fair that you contribute to the estate. You make a fantastic salary with your fintech company. $6,000 is nothing to you. Stop making a scene and just pay the rent. The betrayal was immediate and sharp. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I sat there looking at the man I had promised to spend my life with. This was the same man whose failing startup I had quietly subsidized for 2 years. The same man whose luxury car payments were automatically deducted from my personal checking account every month because he claimed his capital was tied up in investments. I had built my fortune in real estate and financial technology through grueling 80-hour work weeks, sacrificing my sleep and my social life to create software that revolutionized property management. I had handed him the lifestyle of a millionaire on a silver platter, and here he was actively participating in a shakedown orchestrated by his mother. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew his mother did not own this building. But Jamal was a coward who preferred to live inside Loretta's fantasy of generational wealth rather than admit he was being entirely supported by his wife. He wanted to take my hard-earned tech money and funnel it directly into his mother's manicured hands just so they could keep playing their twisted game of high society pretend. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly. "Honestly, Maya, you are being so selfish right now," she chimed in perfectly, echoing her brother's sentiment. "You have all this money from your tech stuff, and you act like contributing to the Sterling family is some massive burden. Jamal gave you a respectable name. You should be grateful we are letting you invest in our legacy instead of acting like a spoiled brat." I looked at the three of them. Loretta with her manufactured outrage, Chloe with her unearned arrogance, and Jamal with his pathetic cowardly avoidance. A lesser woman might have screamed. A different woman might have cried, thrown her napkin on the table, and stormed out of the room in a flurry of tears and heartbreak. They were waiting for that. They wanted me to lose my composure so they could label me as the angry, irrational outsider who just did not know how to handle high society pressures. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I did not even let my breathing change. I felt a profound, absolute sense of calm wash over me. It was the kind of icy clarity that only comes when you realize a relationship is completely, irreparably dead. The love I had felt for Jamal evaporated in that instant, replaced by the calculating, strategic mindset that had made me a millionaire by the time I was 30. They wanted to treat me like a business transaction. They wanted to play landlord and tenant. I was more than happy to oblige. I picked up my linen napkin, gracefully dabbed the corners of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I folded my hands together and rested them on the marble table, letting a warm, serene smile spread across my face. I looked directly at my husband, pinning him under a gaze so cold I saw him physically shudder. "You know what, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice light and conversational. "You make a very compelling argument. You are absolutely right. $6,700 is a significant amount of money to pay for a space where I am clearly not valued as a wife or respected as an equal." Loretta sat up a little straighter, a triumphant gleam returning to her eyes as she assumed I was submitting to her demand. Jamal let out a heavy breath, looking incredibly relieved that he had managed to bully me into submission without a shouting match. I kept my eyes locked on Jamal. "If I am just a tenant here," I continued, my voice silky and pleasant, "and the landlord is arbitrarily raising the rent to fund an estate I have no stake in, then this arrangement no longer makes financial sense for me, so I will not be paying that invoice. Then I will just go back to my apartment." The relief vanished from Jamal's face in an instant. His brow furrowed in deep, genuine confusion. He blinked rapidly, his mind clearly struggling to process the sentence I had just spoken. He looked at the torn invoice, then back at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. "What apartment?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly on the second word. I let the question hang in the air for a long, delicious moment. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Loretta was frowning, her eyes darting between me and her son. Chloe had actually put her phone down. They were all staring at me, waiting for the punchline, waiting for an explanation. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already vanished, and they were just waiting for gravity to take effect. "The apartment I bought before I met you, Jamal. The one overlooking Piedmont Park. The one you conveniently forgot I still own because you were too busy playing real estate mogul with a property that does not belong to you." I leaned back in my chair, swirling the wine in my glass, watching the blood completely drain from his face. It was a fascinating transformation. The arrogant posture he had held just moments ago completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped, and a fine sheen of sweat broke out across his forehead. He glanced frantically at his mother, then back at me, his eyes pleading silently for me to stop. But the time for protecting his fragile ego was over. Loretta slammed her hand onto the marble table, making the silverware rattle. "What on earth are you talking about, Maya?" she demanded, her voice shrill and grating. "Jamal bought this penthouse 5 months ago. He told us all about the closing process. He even showed us the financing paperwork. He financed this entire $2.5 million property because his tech company is booming. Do not sit there and try to claim my son's achievements as your own, just because you are feeling spiteful about a simple rent invoice." A laugh bubbled up in my chest, low and genuine. I could not help it. The sheer absurdity of the lie was too rich. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the high ceilings and custom crown molding. I set my wine glass down and looked directly into Jamal's panicked, darting eyes. "Financing paperwork," I repeated, shaking my head in pure disbelief. "Is that what you showed them, Jamal? Did you print out some fake amortization schedule from the internet to impress Mommy?" "Maya, stop," Jamal hissed, his voice dropping to an urgent, desperate whisper. "We can talk about this later, not right now." "Oh, we are absolutely talking about this right now," I snapped back, dropping the conversational tone and letting the steel in my voice show. "Because I am tired of subsidizing your delusions." I turned my attention back to Loretta, who was glaring at me with a mixture of confusion and mounting rage. "Loretta," I said slowly, making sure she absorbed every single word. "Jamal did not buy this penthouse. He did not finance this penthouse. Do you want to know why? Because, Jamal, your credit score is 580. You could not finance a Honda Civic on a 72-month loan, let alone a $2.5 million penthouse." Loretta gasped loudly, physically recoiling in her chair as if I had reached across the table and slapped her. Her hand flew to her chest again, clutching her pearls in a display of dramatic offense. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the large dining room. "How dare you speak to my son like that? Jamal is a sterling. He went to a private academy. He owns a tech startup. He is the golden boy of our family. You will not sit in his house and disrespect him with these vicious ghetto lies." "His house," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Chloe, do me a favor. You are already on your phone. Go ahead and pull up the Fulton County Public Property Records. They are available online for anyone to see. Search this address. Go on. Read the name on the deed aloud for your mother." Chloe hesitated, her thumbs hovering over her screen. She looked at Jamal, waiting for him to tell her it was a bluff. But Jamal was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched tight, completely silent. The silence was louder than any confession. Chloe swallowed hard and nervously tapped her screen, navigating to the county website. I did not wait for her to find it. I did not need to. "The deed is in my maiden name," I stated, slicing through the heavy tension in the room. "Maya Caldwell. Not Maya Sterling. Not Jamal Sterling. Not the Sterling Family Trust. I bought this property entirely in cash 3 years ago, before I ever had the misfortune of letting your son put a ring on my finger. The only reason Jamal has been living here is because I allowed it." Loretta's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. She looked at her son, waiting for him to defend himself, waiting for him to shut me down and prove that he was the wealthy, successful man she had bragged about to all her country club friends. "Jamal, tell her she is lying," Loretta demanded, her voice shaking with indignant fury. "Tell this woman to pack her bags and leave your property." Jamal did not move. He kept his eyes glued to his half-eaten plate of salmon. "Mom, just drop it," he muttered miserably. "Drop it!" Loretta shrieked, her facade of high society grace completely dissolving into raw, unchecked panic. "What do you mean, drop it? Did you or did you not buy this penthouse?" "He did not." I answered for him because I knew he lacked the spine to say the words himself. "He has been lying to you for 5 months, Loretta. Just like he has been lying to you about his startup. That tech company you are so proud of, it has not generated a single dollar in revenue in over 2 years. It is a financial black hole." I have been paying for his server hosting his virtual assistants and his marketing software out of my personal business accounts just to keep his little vanity project afloat. Chloe dropped her phone onto the table with a clatter. You are lying, she said, though her voice lacked its usual arrogant bite. Jamal pays for everything. He pays for our family vacations. He bought Mom that Rolex for her birthday last month. I smiled, feeling a distinct sense of satisfaction as I dismantled the final pillars of their shared delusion. I bought that Rolex, Chloe. Your brother used the Platinum American Express card that is linked directly to my corporate account. I saw the charge. I let it slide because he told me it was a milestone birthday, and he wanted to make her feel special. I funded the trip to Cabo. I paid for the first-class flights. I paid for the private villa. Every single luxury you have experienced since Jamal and I got married has been funded entirely by the woman you just told to pay rent. Loretta looked like she was struggling to breathe. The reality was crashing down on her, destroying the narrative she had spent years cultivating. She had built her entire identity around being the matriarch of a wealthy, elite family. She had looked down her nose at me because I came from a working-class background, because I built my wealth instead of inheriting it. And now she was sitting at my table, eating the food I bought inside the multi-million-dollar home I owned, realizing that her golden boy was nothing more than a broke, lying grifter living off his wife's success. You are a vicious, spiteful woman, Loretta spat out, her voice dripping with venom, though it trembled slightly. You are just trying to humiliate him because you resent our family legacy. The Sterling Trust is very real. The Sterling Trust has exactly $412 in it. I shot back without missing a beat. I know this because Jamal asked me to cover the maintenance fees for the trust's bank account last year. Your so-called generational wealth dried up when your grandfather passed away, Loretta. There is no empire. There is no legacy. There is just you pretending to be a socialite, and your son pretending to be a CEO. Jamal finally snapped. He slammed both his hands onto the marble table and stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. That is enough, Maya, he yelled. His face twisted in anger, trying to reclaim some shred of his shattered masculinity. You do not get to speak to my family this way. You do not get to disrespect us. I did not flinch. I did not move back. I remained perfectly seated, looking up at him with absolute disdain. I get to do whatever I want, Jamal, I replied, my voice dangerously soft. Because I am the one holding the purse strings. I am the one who owns the roof over your head. And as of this exact moment, I am the one cutting you off. The anger in Jamal's eyes flickered, quickly replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization. He had pushed too far. He had let his mother insult the only person keeping him from total financial ruin. And now the vault was permanently closed. I stood up, slowly smoothing the fabric of my dress. The dinner was over. The marriage was over. And the real eviction was about to begin. I remained standing, smoothing the fabric of my dress, letting the absolute finality of my words settle over the room. Jamal looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. Loretta was practically hyperventilating, her carefully constructed high society persona reduced to ruins. For a fleeting second, I thought the room would remain frozen in this shocked silence, allowing me to calmly instruct them all to locate the nearest exit. But I had momentarily forgotten about the other two guests sitting quietly at the far end of my custom marble table. Malik, Jamal's older brother, and his wife Mackenzie had been entirely focused on the honey bourbon salmon while Loretta launched her initial attack. They had stayed out of the crossfire, likely hoping to reap the benefits of the rent invoice without getting their hands dirty. But now that the vault was officially closed and the Sterling family pride was lying in tatters on my dining room floor, Mackenzie decided it was her moment to shine. Mackenzie cleared her throat, a soft, deliberate sound meant to draw the attention of the room. She was a white woman who perpetually dressed in earth tones and chunky silver jewelry, carrying an aura of unearned moral superiority wherever she went. She possessed a master's degree in sociology and loved to operate under the delusion that she was the designated peacekeeper and cultural savior of the Sterling family. Maya, let us all just take a collective grounding breath, Mackenzie said, raising her hands with her palms facing outward in a placating, deeply patronizing gesture. I can hear the anger in your voice, and I want to validate that your feelings of frustration are entirely real. But I feel like we are entering a space of toxic individualism right now, and it is incredibly damaging to the family structure. I slowly turned my head to look at her. I did not say a word. I just let her dig the grave. You have to understand the systemic barriers Jamal is facing. Mackenzie continued, her voice adopting the soothing, condescending cadence of a therapist speaking to a distressed child. Black men in America deal with unimaginable hurdles in the corporate and tech sectors. Jamal is a visionary. He is trying to build something lasting. As a successful Black woman who has managed to navigate those same systemic barriers, you hold a position of immense power. It is your responsibility to uplift your partner, not financially emasculate him in front of his family. Malik nodded vigorously beside her, reaching out to pat his wife's hand in a show of unified support. She is right, Maya. Malik added, his tone thick with unwarranted authority. You are acting like an oppressor in your own home. Marriage is a partnership. Withholding your assets and hiding your property ownership is a form of financial abuse. You are supposed to be building Black generational wealth together, not hoarding it for yourself just to stroke your own ego. Mackenzie offered a sad, sympathetic sigh, leaning forward as if trying to connect with my soul. Exactly, Malik. Maya, true generational wealth is about community and shared resources. By cutting Jamal off, you are exhibiting a trauma response based in scarcity. You are acting out of fear rather than love. We need financial transparency in this family to heal and move forward. You owe Jamal the grace of sharing your success. I stood there listening to the absolute audacity of this woman. She sat at my marble table eating the premium seafood I had purchased, drinking the expensive wine I had poured inside the multi-million-dollar penthouse I owned, and dared to lecture me about Black generational wealth. She dared to use social justice buzzwords to justify her husband and her brother-in-law leeching off a self-made Black woman. I let her finish her performative speech. I let her sit back in her chair with that smug, self-satisfied look of a woman who genuinely believed she had just delivered a profound healing revelation. I did not scream. I did not throw my wine glass. I calmly turned on my heel, walked the few steps over to the kitchen island, and picked up my iPad Pro. I unlocked the screen, pulled up a specific file I had compiled earlier that week, and walked slowly back to the dining table. Mackenzie. I began, keeping my voice incredibly smooth and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. Do not ever sit at my table and weaponize my race, my culture, or the very real systemic struggles of Black Americans to justify theft and financial parasitism. Her smug expression faltered, a flash of genuine alarm crossing her eyes as I stepped closer to her end of the table. You want to talk about financial transparency? I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. You want to talk about shared resources and building community. Let us have a transparent conversation right now about how your community is actually funded. I tapped the screen of my iPad and placed it directly in front of Mackenzie and Malik. The bright screen illuminated a heavily highlighted bank statement. You see, Mackenzie, when Jamal told me his tech startup needed a sudden injection of capital for software development 3 months ago, I asked to see the vendor invoices. I am an investor. I deal in facts, not blind faith. When he refused to provide them, citing proprietary secrets, I ran a forensic audit on the accounts I had given him access to. Do you know what I found? Malik suddenly shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the iPad screen. His confident posture vanished instantly. Maya, this is a private conversation between you and Jamal. Malik interrupted hastily. We do not need to bring other business matters into this. Oh, but you brought yourselves into this, Malik, I said, smiling down at him with zero warmth. Mackenzie just begged for financial transparency, and I am simply honoring her request. I leaned over and pointed at the highlighted lines on the screen. For the past year, Jamal has been making bi-weekly wire transfers of $3,000 to an entity called Sterling Enterprise Investments. That sounds very official, does it not? It sounds like the kind of vehicle used to build that generational wealth Mackenzie is so passionate about. Except Sterling Enterprise Investments is not a holding company. It is a Shell LLC registered to you, Malik. Mackenzie blinked, looking down at the screen, then turning a confused gaze toward her husband. Malik, what is she talking about? I will tell you exactly what I am talking about, I answered before he could formulate a lie. Jamal has been taking the money I provided to keep his dead startup afloat and siphoning it directly into his brother's bank account. And do you know where those funds went next, Mackenzie? They went to pay the commercial lease for your sustainable yoga studio. They went to fund your ethical wellness brand. Mackenzie's face turned a brilliant mottled shade of crimson. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. That is right, I said, ensuring my voice carried to Loretta and Jamal at the other end of the table. Your socially conscious independent business has been completely subsidized by the trauma responses and toxic individualism of the Black woman you just tried to lecture. I have been paying your rent. I have been buying your organic inventory. I have been funding your entire culturally aware lifestyle. Loretta looked like she was about to faint. She grabbed her chest, staring at her oldest son in absolute horror. Malik, tell me this is a lie, Loretta demanded, her voice shaking. Tell me you did not take money from Jamal. Malik could not meet his mother's eyes. He looked down at the floor, his silence confirming everything. Jamal had been playing the role of the wealthy benefactor to his older brother, using my bank accounts to fund the illusion that the Sterling men were powerful entrepreneurs. You called me an oppressor, Malik, I said, stepping back from the table and crossing my arms. You accused me of hoarding my wealth, but the reality is that I have been carrying this entire family on my back. I funded the vacations, I bought the jewelry, I paid for the yoga studio, I financed the illusion of the Sterling family legacy. I looked directly at Mackenzie, whose eyes were now welling with humiliated tears. So please, Mackenzie, spare me your graduate school theories on community building. You are not a savior, you are a dependent, and your husband is not a victim of systemic barriers. He is an accomplice in a scheme to defraud me. I picked up my iPad, the screen going dark as I locked it. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. There was no more pretense. There was no more hiding behind tailored suits, expensive wine, and empty academic rhetoric. They were exposed, stripped of their titles and their pride, standing bare in the harsh light of my financial reality. Jamal was staring at his hands completely broken. Malik was gripping the edge of the table, avoiding his wife's tearful glare. Loretta looked as though she had aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. You wanted rent, Loretta, I said, breaking the heavy silence one last time. You wanted a residential contribution. Well, the free ride is officially over for all of you. Jamal, you have until tomorrow morning to pack your bags and vacate my property. If you are still here when my private security team arrives at 8 o'clock, they will forcefully remove you. I turned my attention to Malik and Mackenzie. And as for Sterling Enterprise Investments, I have already instructed my legal team to file a civil suit for the recovery of embezzled funds. You will be receiving the formal summons by the end of the week. You can use your deep understanding of systemic barriers to explain to the judge why you thought you were entitled to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from my corporate accounts. I did not wait for their responses. I did not need to. I turned my back on the four of them, walked calmly out of the dining room, and headed down the hallway toward the master suite. The sound of my heels clicking against the custom hardwood floors echoed through the penthouse, ringing out like the final definitive slam of a judge's gavel. I had barely made it halfway down the corridor toward the master suite when the shrill, desperate sound of Loretta's voice echoed behind me. Delusion is a remarkably stubborn disease, and Loretta was infected down to the bone. You are bluffing! She shrieked, the sound of her heels stomping against the hardwood floor as she chased after me. The Sterling Family Trust has held property in this city since before you were even born. Jamal is an executive. He showed me the closing documents. You are just a bitter, jealous woman trying to steal my son's real estate portfolio because he finally asked you to contribute your fair share. I stopped dead in my tracks. I closed my eyes and took one deep, centering breath. I had fully intended to leave them sitting in the ruins of their own making, but some people simply beg for total annihilation. I pivoted on my heel and walked straight back into the dining room. Loretta was standing near the head of the table, clutching the back of her chair as if it were a life raft in a hurricane. Jamal had his head buried in his hands, completely defeated, but Malik and Mackenzie were staring at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. They were still desperately clinging to the hope that Loretta was right, that my claims were just the exaggerated threats of an angry wife. I picked up my iPad from the kitchen island. I did not pull up another private bank statement. This required something much more public, much more permanent. I navigated directly to the Fulton County Public Property Tax Database, a government website that no one could accuse me of doctoring. I typed in the address of our high-rise building, pulled up the master parcel records, and walked purposefully over to Mackenzie. I slid the sleek glass device right across the marble table, pushing it directly over Mackenzie's untouched plate. Since you are the family's resident expert on establishing and maintaining generational wealth, Mackenzie, I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of warmth, I think you should be the one to present the facts to the table. Read the screen. Mackenzie shrank back in her chair, her earth-toned outfit suddenly looking very small against the massive looming reality of the moment. Her eyes darted to Malik, pleading for him to intervene, but Malik was completely paralyzed. Read it out loud, Mackenzie, I commanded, leaning slightly over the table. You had plenty of breath to lecture me about systemic barriers and toxic individualism 5 minutes ago. Use that same confident voice now. Read the registered owner of this penthouse. Read it loud enough for Loretta to hear. Mackenzie's hands trembled as she reached out and pulled the iPad closer. She swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the bright screen. The registered owner, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Louder, I insisted. The registered owner is Caldwell Premier Holdings, LLC. Mackenzie read, her voice cracking as the words left her mouth. Thank you, I said. Now tell the room who is listed as the sole managing member and registered agent of Caldwell Premier Holdings, LLC. Mackenzie kept her eyes glued to the screen, entirely unable to look up at her mother-in-law. Maya Caldwell, she read. I turned my head slowly toward Loretta. Caldwell, I repeated, not Sterling. I formed that LLC and purchased this penthouse 3 years before your son even knew my name. I secured this property while Jamal was still living with roommates in a rented townhouse in Midtown. Loretta collapsed back into her chair. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and deeply aged. The grand matriarch of the Sterling family was finally faced with the undeniable publicly recorded truth. But I was not quite finished. I tapped the screen of the iPad, highlighting the adjacent property records. Keep reading, Mackenzie, I instructed. Scroll down to the units listed directly beneath this one. Units 50A and 49B. Tell Loretta who owns those. Mackenzie scrolled down with a shaking finger. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of Jamal's shattered illusion. Caldwell Premier Holdings, LLC. Mackenzie whispered, a tear actually spilling over her eyelashes as the sheer magnitude of my financial footprint dawned on her. That is right, I said, stepping back and addressing the entire table. You tried to hand me a rent invoice for $6,700 to live in my own home. Meanwhile, the corporate executives leasing the 2 luxury units directly beneath our feet have been paying me $10,000 a month each for the last 4 years. I am not just the owner of this penthouse. I am the landlord for the sky-high real estate your golden boy claimed to possess. I looked at Jamal, who had not moved a single muscle. His entire existence had been exposed as a carefully constructed fraud. He needed his mother's validation so desperately that he had built a fantasy world using my assets as the foundation. He played the king of the castle, basking in the praise of his family, while I quietly paid the mortgage, managed the properties, and built the actual empire he pretended to rule. He told you he was a real estate mogul, I said to Loretta, who was now staring at her son with a look of absolute betrayal. He showed you fake closing documents because he was too ashamed to admit that his tech startup was a failure and that his wife was the only reason he had a roof over his head. You raised a man who prefers to steal credit from a black woman rather than put in the work to build his own legacy. Malik ran a hand over his face, the realization of his own complicity washing over him. He had taken the embezzled funds from Jamal, fully believing his younger brother was a massive success story. Now he knew he was just catching the crumbs of my hard-earned money that I had generated while they all looked down on me. The illusion of the Sterling family wealth shattered completely, leaving nothing but dust and bruised egos on my dining room floor. There was no more lecturing. There were no more condescending remarks about my background or my career. I had systematically dismantled every single lie they had built their pride upon, and I had done it using cold, hard, indisputable public records. "You have all overstayed your welcome," I said, retrieving my iPad from the table. "Jamal, my previous timeline still stands. You have until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to gather your personal belongings and vacate my property. If you attempt to take anything that was purchased with my funds, I will press charges for theft." I looked at Loretta, Malik, and Mackenzie, who were all sitting in a state of absolute shock. "And the three of you can show yourselves out right now. Do not ever return to this building. If you try to pass the security desk in the lobby, you will be arrested for trespassing." I turned my back on them for the final time. The dinner was ruined, the marriage was over, but my peace of mind had never been clearer. I walked down the hallway, leaving the Sterling family to navigate the harsh, unforgiving reality of their own making. I had not even reached the heavy oak double doors of the master suite when the frantic, aggressive clicking of Loretta's heels echoed down the hallway behind me. Delusion is one thing, but narcissistic rage is an entirely different beast. A normal person, having just been publicly exposed as a fraud and a parasite, would have gathered whatever dignity they had left and quietly exited the premises. But Loretta was not a normal person. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life bending reality to fit her fragile ego, and she was absolutely refusing to let my reality crush hers. "Maya, get back here right now!" Loretta shrieked, her voice completely devoid of its usual high society polish. It was raw, guttural, and trembling with unfiltered fury. I paused, turning around slowly. Loretta was marching down the hallway, her face twisted into a mask of pure indignation. Jamal was trailing a few paces behind her, looking like a terrified child being dragged to the principal's office, while Malik and Mackenzie hovered cautiously near the dining room archway, eager to witness the carnage, but too cowardly to step into the line of fire. "You do not get to dictate terms to us," Loretta spat, closing the distance between us until she was standing just a few feet away. "You are Jamal's wife. Do you understand what that means in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of God? When you married my son, you became one entity. What is yours is his. This penthouse, those rental units, that holding company, it all belongs to the Sterling family now by right of marriage." I stared at her, genuinely marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity radiating from her posture. She was backed into a corner, completely stripped of her lies, and her defense mechanism was to simply demand everything I owned. "You think you can just embarrass him in front of his family and walk away holding all the cards?" Loretta continued, her chest heaving as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are a wife. Your role is to build up your husband, not tear him down. If you really care about this marriage, if you have any respect for the commitment you made to my son, you will sign the deed to this property over to the Sterling Family Trust immediately." The hallway went dead silent. Even Jamal looked up, his eyes widening in shock at his mother's astronomical demand. "You need to prove your loyalty to this family," Maya Loretta commanded, her voice dropping into a menacing, authoritative tone. "You need to secure Jamal's future and restore his rightful place as the head of this household. You will sign the paperwork transferring Caldwell Premier Holdings to the trust by tomorrow morning. It is the only way you are going to save this marriage and prove you are not just some selfish, calculating outsider." I looked at Loretta, and in that exact moment, the final lingering shred of empathy I possessed for this family evaporated into thin air. I did not just see a desperate, delusional mother protecting her son. I saw a financial parasite. I saw a woman who viewed my black excellence, my relentless work ethic, and my corporate success as nothing more than a buffet line for her mediocre sons. She did not want me as a daughter-in-law. She wanted me as an acquisition. She wanted to harvest my wealth to fund her country club memberships, her green juice-drinking daughter-in-law's failing yoga studio, and her golden boy's pathetic charade. "The gloves were officially off, Loretta," I said, keeping my voice incredibly soft and lethal. The fact that you are standing in my hallway demanding that I sign over a $2.5 million asset to a bankrupt trust just to soothe your son's shattered ego proves exactly why your family has absolutely nothing to your name. You do not build wealth, you steal it, you leech off it. And when you are exposed, you throw a temper tantrum and demand a handout. How dare you? Loretta gasped, stepping forward as if she might actually try to physically intimidate me. Take one more step toward me, and I will have you arrested for trespassing and assault, I warned, locking my eyes onto hers with an intensity that froze her perfectly in place. You want to talk about the law, Loretta? Let us talk about the law. You seem to be operating under the absurd assumption that marriage is a blank check. But Georgia is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state. And more importantly, this penthouse and the LLC that holds it are strictly premarital assets. I bought them before Jamal even possessed a key to this front door. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to lean back slightly. But I did not stop there. I continued, my voice echoing off the hallway walls, because I saw the red flags long before I walked down the aisle. I saw the way Jamal avoided conversations about credit scores. I saw the way you constantly probed into my business profits. So before we got married, I had my attorneys draft an ironclad, bulletproof prenuptial agreement. An agreement that explicitly walls off Caldwell Premier Holdings, my personal accounts, my corporate accounts, and every single property I acquire, past, present, and future. Jamal flinched visibly. He knew exactly what I was talking about. And your brilliant visionary son, I said, gesturing toward Jamal with absolute disgust, was so eager to lock down his meal ticket that he signed it without even retaining his own outside counsel. He signed away any legal right to a single dime of my empire because he was terrified I would run a background check and discover he was drowning in consumer debt. Loretta whipped her head around to look at Jamal. You signed a prenup, she hissed, her voice cracking with pure venom. You signed away your rights to the properties. He did not sign away his rights, Loretta. I corrected her sharply. He never had any rights to begin with. He was a guest in my financial bracket, and he has officially worn out his welcome. I turned my attention back to the matriarch of the Sterling family, watching the reality of her total defeat finally sink into her bones. There would be no grand real estate transfer. There would be no saving face. You demanded that I prove my loyalty to save this marriage, I said, letting a cold, mocking smile touch my lips. Let me make something crystal clear for you. I do not want to save this marriage. I am actively terminating it. I will burn this high-rise to the ground before I ever give your family a single brick of my foundation. I pulled my cell phone from the pocket of my dress and held it up. I am giving you exactly 60 seconds to walk out of my front door, I announced, tapping the screen to bring up the keypad. If you, Malik or Mackenzie, are still inside my penthouse when that minute is up, I am calling the building security team, and I will have you all escorted out through the lobby in handcuffs. Think about how that will look to your high society friends, Loretta. The great Sterling matriarch dragged out of a building she claimed to own, crying over rent money she could not extort. Loretta stared at me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to speak, to launch one last desperate volley of insults, but there was nothing left to say. Her ammunition was entirely depleted. 50 seconds, I said, looking down at my phone. Mom, let us just go. Jamal finally spoke, his voice trembling and defeated. He reached out and grabbed his mother's arm, pulling her back toward the dining room. Maya is not playing. Just go. I will handle my things tomorrow. Loretta yanked her arm out of his grasp, but she did not step forward again. She glared at me, her face contorted with a lifetime of unchecked pride that was currently bleeding out on my floor. She spun around and marched back down the hallway, grabbing her designer handbag off the dining table with a violent snatch. Malik and Mackenzie were already heading for the foyer, not waiting to be told twice. Mackenzie had her head bowed, avoiding all eye contact, while Malik rushed to call the elevator, eager to escape the humiliating reality check I had just delivered. I followed them at a distance, making sure every single one of them crossed the threshold. Jamal lingered by the doorway for a fraction of a second, looking back at me with an expression that was part apology and part panic. He was about to enter the real world without my platinum card to shield him, and the terror in his eyes was unmistakable. I did not offer him a parting word. I simply reached out and firmly closed the heavy custom door right in his face, the lock clicking into place with a deeply satisfying permanent sound. The silence that settled over my penthouse was beautiful. The parasites were gone, and the empire was entirely mine. I stopped dead in my tracks. The heavy custom door was just inches from clicking shut when Jamal's hand shot out, catching the thick mahogany frame. He shoved his weight against the wood, forcing the door back open and stepping squarely into my marble foyer. His mother, brother, and sister-in-law were already retreating down the corridor toward the private elevator, but Jamal stood frozen on my welcome mat. His chest was heaving. The sheer panic that had dominated his features just moments ago was rapidly morphing into a desperate manufactured rage. He was trying to summon the ghost of his bruised masculinity. "Maya, you have lost your mind," he growled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You do not disrespect my mother like that. You do not kick my family out into the hallway like they are common criminals. I am your husband. I am the head of this household, and you will show some respect." I stood there in the center of the foyer, looking at the man I had married. It was genuinely fascinating to watch him try to pull rank in a kingdom he did not build. He had no money, he had no power, he had no leverage whatsoever. Yet he was puffing out his chest, attempting to use the hollow title of husband to override the factual reality of my ownership. He actually believed that raising his voice would make me forget that I had been funding his entire existence. "You are the head of the household," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with a slow, deliberate mockery. "That is an interesting delusion, Jamal. Tell me, does the head of the household usually steal from his wife to pay his brother's commercial lease? Does the head of the household forge financing documents to impress his mother? You are not the head of anything. You are a dependent who just got his allowance revoked." Jamal took a step forward, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "You are my wife," he demanded, his voice echoing in the vast open space of the penthouse. "You took a vow. You are supposed to build with me, not tear me down the second things get difficult. My mother was right. You have no respect for the structure of a black family. You are acting out of pure spite because you want to be the one in control." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply turned my back on him and walked away. I headed straight past the dining room, past the open concept kitchen with its imported Italian countertops, and walked purposefully toward the master suite. Jamal followed hot on my heels, taking my silence as a sign of retreat. He thought he was winning. He thought his sudden burst of patriarchal authority had finally put me in my place. "You cannot just walk away when I am speaking to you, Maya," he called out, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor behind me. "We are going to fix this. You are going to apologize to my mother, and we are going to sit down and figure out a real financial plan for the trust. You are not throwing my family away over a misunderstanding." I pushed open the double doors to the master bedroom and walked directly into my massive, custom-built walk-in closet. I bypassed the racks of designer dresses and the shelves of luxury shoes, heading straight for the back corner. You see, what Jamal failed to realize is that a successful businesswoman never enters a negotiation without an exit strategy. When I ran the forensic audit on our accounts last week and discovered the wire transfers to his brother's shell company, I did not just sit around and cry. I planned. I organized. I stayed ready so I would not have to get ready. I reached into the storage alcove and grabbed the handle of a sleek, heavy-duty designer suitcase. It was fully packed. I had spent an hour last Tuesday meticulously folding his essential clothing, packing his toiletries, and securing his absolute favorite expensive watches, the ones I had bought him, of course, into this very bag. I knew the moment I confronted his mother he would choose his family's toxic delusion over my reality. I had prepared his severance package in advance. I gripped the handle, rolled the heavy suitcase out of the closet, and walked back into the master bedroom. Jamal was standing near the foot of our king-sized bed, still lecturing me about respect and marriage vows. I did not say a word. I just shoved the suitcase hard across the plush carpet. It glided smoothly across the floor and slammed directly into his shins with a loud, definitive thud. Jamal stumbled back, looking down at the luggage as if it were an explosive device. The righteous anger drained out of him, instantly replaced by that same wide-eyed, hollow terror I had seen in the dining room. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice dropping back into a pathetic whisper. "That is your reality check, Jamal," I said, crossing my arms over my chest and staring him down. "I packed your bags last Tuesday right after I found the receipts for your brother's yoga studio. I have been waiting all week for you to come clean, to act like a man, to apologize for stealing from the woman who gave you everything. Instead, you sat at my table and let your mother hand me an eviction notice." "Maya, please!" he begged, all the false bravado melting away completely. "You do not mean this. Where am I supposed to go? I do not have an apartment. I do not have anywhere to stay." "That sounds like a spectacular problem for the head of the household to solve," I replied, my voice dripping with ice. "Maybe the Sterling Family Trust has a spare room available for you. Maybe Mackenzie can set up a cot in the back of her ethical wellness studio. But you are not staying here." I walked toward him, forcing him to step backward toward the bedroom door. "Pick up the bag, Jamal." He looked at me, tears genuinely forming in the corners of his eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to grasp my arm, trying to find the loving, accommodating woman he had manipulated for 2 years. "Maya, I love you. I can fix this. I will pay you back every single cent. Just give me a chance." "Do not touch me!" I snapped, my tone so sharp it made him flinch physically. "You do not love me. You love my credit limit. You love the view from this penthouse. You love playing a rich man on my dime. Pick up the bag and get out of my house before I call the police and tell them an intruder is refusing to leave my property." He saw the absolute finality in my eyes. There was no negotiation left. The well had run completely dry. Slowly, with his shoulders slumped in total defeat, Jamal reached down and grabbed the handle of the designer suitcase. He looked like a broken man, stripped of every illusion he had ever wrapped himself in. He turned around and dragged the heavy bag down the hallway. I followed him every step of the way, making sure he did not linger, making sure he did not try to snatch anything else on his way out. He walked into the foyer, where the front door was still standing wide open. His mother, Malik, and Mackenzie were waiting out by the private elevators. Loretta let out a loud gasp when she saw her golden boy walking out with his luggage, realizing that her grand plan to secure my wealth had just rendered her son completely homeless. "Get in the elevator with your mother, Jamal," I said, standing in the doorway and looking out at the 4 of them. "And do not ever contact me again. My attorney will be serving you the divorce papers at your mother's house." I reached out, grabbed the heavy mahogany door, and slammed it shut with every ounce of strength I had. The lock clicked, the deadbolt engaged, the penthouse went completely, beautifully quiet. I stood in the foyer, listening to the absolute silence of my own home. I was alone, and I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. I remained in the foyer for a full minute, simply listening to the absolute tranquility of my own home. It was not the deafening, lonely silence of a broken marriage. It was the crisp, immaculate quiet of a space that had just been fumigated. I did not slide down the door and weep. I did not reach for my phone to call my girlfriends and vent. Crying is a biological response to loss, and I had not lost anything of actual value tonight. I had simply taken out the trash. Walking back into the dining room, I noticed the scent of honey bourbon salmon still lingering in the air. The 2 torn halves of Loretta's ridiculous invoice lay on the pristine marble table, looking like garbage next to the crystal glasses. I picked up the heavy cardstock and stared at the numbers printed in bold black ink. $6,700. My mind, trained by years of spotting discrepancies in high-stakes commercial real estate deals, snagged on that specific figure. Narcissists like Loretta are inherently greedy, but they are also highly calculated when they are desperate. If she had simply wanted to bleed me dry to fund her country club lunches, she would have asked for a flat $10,000. If she was trying to be somewhat subtle, she might have asked for 5. But 6,700 was not a random number pulled from the sky to sound like a realistic rent payment. It was exact. It was purposeful. It was a required monthly installment for a very specific, very urgent liability. I walked over to the kitchen island, poured myself a fresh splash of my $200 Cabernet, and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Atlanta skyline. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed a number I reserved strictly for corporate emergencies. Marcus Vance answered on the second ring. Marcus was a ruthless, brilliant forensic accountant who worked exclusively with high-net-worth individuals. He was a man who could track a missing dollar through 5 offshore shell companies, a crypto exchange, and a Cayman Islands trust fund without breaking a sweat. We had worked together during my most aggressive property acquisitions, and he knew exactly how my mind operated. Marcus, I said, bypassing any polite introductions, I need you to run a full scorched earth financial background check on my husband and his immediate family. There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. Consider it done, Maya. What specific parameters are we looking at? I want you to look into a shell company called Sterling Enterprise Investments, registered to his brother, Malik. Sterling, I instructed, taking a slow sip of my wine. But more importantly, I need you to pull every public record tax lien and credit report associated with his mother, Loretta Sterling. She just tried to hand me a fake rent invoice for exactly $6,700. That number means something. Find out what she is defaulting on. Give me 48 hours, Marcus replied smoothly. I will dismantle their entire financial history down to the last penny. I ended the call, set my wine glass on the coffee table, and marched directly toward the guest bedroom that Jamal had converted into his so-called home office. He absolutely loved this room. He had decorated it with a massive oak desk, an ergonomic leather executive chair, and framed inspirational quotes about the grind and hustle culture. He wanted to feel like a powerful CEO while spending his days playing video games and siphoning my corporate funds. I pushed the door open and flipped on the bright overhead lights. Jamal had taken his designer clothes, his luxury shoes, and the expensive watches I had bought him, but in his panicked, humiliating exit, he had left behind his most vulnerable asset, his paperwork. He thought he was a mastermind, but he was incredibly sloppy. I bypassed the obvious places, first skipping the filing cabinet that held old business magazines and junk mail. I walked straight over to the custom-built bookshelf. Behind a perfectly arranged row of unread biographies on tech billionaires, I found exactly what I was looking for, a sleek, heavy-duty biometric lockbox. Jamal had purchased it online a few months ago, bragging about how he needed military-grade security for his proprietary software patents. What my brilliant visionary husband did not know was that while he was supposedly on a weekend networking retreat, I had noticed the battery indicator flashing red. When I replaced the batteries, the system performed a factory reset, and I casually added my own thumbprint to the master registry, just to see if I could. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing scanner. A soft chime echoed in the quiet office. The indicator light flashed green, and the heavy lid clicked open. The lockbox did not contain a single line of proprietary code or software patents. Inside was a thick, disorganized, chaotic stack of manila folders and crumpled envelopes. I pulled the entire stack out, carried it over to his massive oak desk, and spread the documents out under the bright desk lamp. My eyes scanned the papers, rapidly sifting through the absolute financial wreckage of my husband's secret life. There were credit card statements with maximum limits entirely blown out, plagued by late fees and overdraft penalties. There were personal loan agreements with predatory sky-high interest rates from secondary lenders. It was a masterclass in financial illiteracy. But then, near the bottom of the stack, my hands brushed against a thick, heavy folder, labeled with a single word written in Jamal's messy scrawl: Mom. I opened the folder, and the grand mystery of the $6,700 unraveled before my eyes in stark, undeniable black and white ink. It was not a maintenance fee for an elite generational wealth portfolio. It was a notice of default and intent to foreclose from both the Internal Revenue Service and a predatory secondary lending institution. The documents painted a pathetic, desperate picture. Loretta had taken out a massive, high-interest reverse mortgage on her suburban home several years ago to fund her designer wardrobe, her country club memberships, and her illusion of high society grandeur. On top of that, she had completely stopped paying her property taxes for the last 4 years. The government and the bank had finally come knocking, and they were not accepting her elite status as a form of payment. The paperwork detailed a strict court-mandated structured repayment plan designed to avoid the immediate foreclosure of her home and the seizure of her remaining meager assets. I ran my manicured finger down to the bottom line of the settlement agreement, stopping at the bolded required monthly payment, $6,700. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that filled the empty office. She was not demanding rent. She was trying to trick me into paying her impending bankruptcy settlement under the guise of contributing to a fake family trust. Jamal knew everything. He had the default notices right here in his safe. He had been desperately trying to figure out how to steal that exact amount from my business accounts without triggering an alert from my accounting team. When he realized he could not hide it in his fake tech startup anymore, he and his mother concocted that pathetic dinner ambush. They thought they could shame me, bully me, and manipulate my sense of marital duty into blindly paying off her debt. I gathered the documents, my heart beating with the steady, rhythmic, unstoppable pulse of a predator who had just cornered her prey in a dead-end alley. Jamal had tried to play a dangerous game of financial deception with a woman who built her empire on contracts and ledgers. The upcoming divorce was going to be an absolute bloodbath, and as I looked down at the irrefutable evidence in my hands, I knew I was holding every single weapon. 48 hours later, exactly as promised, my cell phone vibrated on the kitchen island. I had spent the last 2 days enjoying the immaculate silence of my Jamal-free penthouse. There were no passive-aggressive sighs, no performative business calls echoing from the guest room, and no lingering scent of a man who thought he could outsmart me. I answered the phone. Marcus did not waste time with pleasantries. "You have a massive pest control problem," Maya Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional over the secure line. "I have completely dismantled their financial history, and honestly, calling it a history is generous. It is more of an ongoing crime scene." I poured myself a cup of black coffee, leaning against the imported Italian marble countertops. "I already figured out the $6,700, I told him. "Loretta is drowning in a reverse mortgage and back taxes. She is on the absolute verge of foreclosure." "That is just the appetizer," Marcus replied, a hint of dark amusement in his tone. "Loretta's financial ruin is standard negligence combined with a shopping addiction. What Malik and Mackenzie have been doing is active, aggressive fraud. Let us talk about Sterling Enterprise Investments." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling my pulse steady into a calm, calculating rhythm. "Tell me everything." Marcus explained the trail with the precision of a surgeon. The bi-weekly wire transfers from Jamal were not going into any legitimate investment portfolio. Sterling Enterprise Investments was a dead-end pass-through account. The money sat there for exactly 24 hours before it was wired directly into another LLC, an entity registered as Aura and Earth Wellness. Aura and Earth, Mackenzie's precious luxury organic lifestyle brand. She boasted about it endlessly at every single family gathering. She claimed she was curating a holistic space for mindful living, selling artisanal healing crystals, hand-woven organic yoga mats, and small-batch essential oils. She positioned herself as a cultural pioneer of ethical commerce, constantly posting on social media about sustainability and spiritual alignment. She loved playing the enlightened business owner whenever she was around me, acting as if her enterprise was somehow morally superior to my real estate developments. "Aura and Earth is a financial black hole," Marcus continued. "The business has not turned a legitimate profit since the day it opened. Her commercial lease in Buckhead is astronomical, and she has virtually zero foot traffic. Her payroll for her so-called spiritual guides is bouncing, but that is not even the best part. I pulled her vendor invoices, Maya. You are going to love this." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city. "Go on." "She is buying cheap, mass-produced junk from overseas wholesalers for literal pennies," Marcus stated bluntly. I tracked the shipping manifests. She is purchasing bulk synthetic oils and factory-molded stones, stripping off the plastic packaging, slapping a minimalist, eco-friendly beige label on them, and marking the price up by 1,000%. Her ethically sourced sage and artisanal crystals are coming from the exact same factories that supply discount dollar stores. The entire brand is a complete and utter sham built on performative wokeness and wholesale fraud. So how is the storefront still open, I asked, though the sickening reality of the answer was already dawning on me. You are keeping the lights on, Maya Marcus said. Your tech money. Malik was too proud to admit to his high society friends that his wife's business was a catastrophic failure. Jamal wanted to play the role of the powerful, wealthy brother who could casually float capital to his family. So Jamal took your money, funneled it to Malik under the guise of an investment, and Malik pumped it directly into Mackenzie's failing vanity project just to keep up appearances. The sheer monumental disrespect of it all settled deep into my bones. Jamal had allowed his wife, a hard-working black woman who built her empire from the ground up, to secretly subsidize the delusional, culturally appropriative vanity project of his white sister-in-law. Mackenzie had sat at my dining room table eating the food I paid for and dared to lecture me about black generational wealth, all while her entire livelihood was secretly funded by my bank accounts. She had weaponized systemic barriers against me to justify stealing my money for her fake healing crystals. It was not just theft. It was a spectacular, breathtaking level of hypocrisy. They had built an entire ecosystem of lies, and I was the involuntary bank, rolling the entire operation. Draft the full report. Marcus, I commanded, setting my coffee mug down on the glass coffee table. I want every single vendor invoice, every wire transfer, every fake shipping manifest, and every bounced payroll check. I want it bound, tabbed, and ready for litigation. I already sent the encrypted files to your legal team, Marcus said, efficient, as always. They are drafting the civil suit for embezzlement and fraud as we speak. You have them dead to rights, Maya. Malik and Jamal committed wire fraud, and Mackenzie is the primary beneficiary. If she tries to claim ignorance, the paper trail will bury her completely. I do not just want to bury her in court, Marcus, I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. I want to bury her in public. Mackenzie's entire brand relied on her pristine, socially conscious reputation. Her clientele consisted of wealthy virtue-signaling suburbanites who would immediately cancel anyone caught operating an unethical, fraudulent supply chain. If I simply sued her quietly, she would play the victim. She would spin a narrative on her social media about a vindictive sister-in-law trying to tear down her small, ethical business. She would use her white tears to manipulate her audience and rebrand herself as a martyr. I refused to give her that opportunity. I needed to rip the rug out from under her in a way that she could never, ever recover from. I thanked Marcus for his exceptional work and ended the call. I immediately dialed my lead attorney. I instructed them to finalize the divorce filings for Jamal and to expedite the civil summons for Malik and Mackenzie. I wanted those lawsuits filed by the end of the week. But legal action was only one part of the strategy. The Sterling family thought they could treat me like a limitless ATM. They thought they could use my brilliance to fund their mediocrity. They were about to find out exactly what happens when the bank decides to foreclose on your entire existence. The eviction of Jamal was just phase 1. Phase 2 was going to be an absolute, unmitigated demolition of their fake empire, and Mackenzie was going to be my very first target. I opened my laptop, pulled up the vendor manifests Marcus had sent, and began making a list of every single luxury influencer and holistic blogger who proudly promoted aura and earth wellness. The truth was about to go viral, and I was going to be the one to press send. I had barely finished compiling my master list of Mackenzie's holistic influencers when a new encrypted email from Marcus landed in my inbox. The subject line read simply, "The origin of the invoice." I opened the attached file expecting to see a standard breakdown of Loretta's shopping debts and unpaid property taxes. Earlier, when I cracked Jamal's biometric safe, I had assumed Loretta's impending foreclosure was the result of a standard reverse mortgage born of her relentless need to maintain a country club lifestyle. But Marcus, with his terrifying attention to detail, had traced the secondary lender listed on the lien. It was not a traditional mortgage company. It was a mezzanine commercial credit firm, the kind of high-risk, high-interest shadow bank that caters exclusively to desperate businesses unable to secure traditional funding. I read through the loan origination documents, my eyes tracing the lines of corporate jargon until I hit the guarantor signatures. There it was, laid out in undeniable black and white: Jamal Sterling and Malik Sterling. They had taken out a massive predatory commercial loan nearly 2 years ago. Why? Because Mackenzie's culturally appropriative crystal and yoga business was bleeding cash at an apocalyptic rate. The wholesale costs for her cheap overseas inventory were piling up, her commercial lease was in arrears, and the facade of the Sterling family's entrepreneurial brilliance was on the verge of total collapse. But to secure a high-risk commercial loan of that magnitude, the shadow bank demanded substantial collateral. Jamal's fake tech startup had zero assets. Malik's shell company was entirely empty. They needed real property. They needed tangible equity. They needed Loretta's house. I scrolled to the final page of the PDF, staring at the notarized signature of Loretta Sterling. She had willingly put her beloved suburban estate, the grand pillared home she used to host her snobby bridge club, and pretend she was Atlanta royalty, up as collateral for her son's commercial loan. She had literally bet her roof on Mackenzie's fake organic wellness brand, and they had lost spectacularly. Aura and Earth continued to hemorrhage capital. The boys defaulted on the predatory loan. The shadow bank did exactly what shadow banks do. They initiated aggressive pre-foreclosure proceedings on the collateral. Loretta's house was actively being seized. I looked at the settlement terms outlined by the commercial creditor. To pause the foreclosure proceedings to keep the bank from chaining the front doors of Loretta's suburban fortress, the creditor demanded a strict, non-negotiable monthly payment plan. The amount was exactly $6,700. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with a sickening, deafening click. I sat back in my plush office chair, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the quiet, luxurious space of my penthouse. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their master plan washed over me. They did not just view me as a convenient source of pocket money. They viewed me as their ultimate, unwitting bailout plan. Jamal, Malik, Mackenzie, and Loretta had sat around a table and actively conspired to trick me into saving them from financial ruin. They knew I would never voluntarily hand over nearly $7,000 a month to pay off a commercial loan that funded Mackenzie's fraudulent business. They knew I despised their entitlement, so they concocted the rent invoice. Loretta, the matriarch, who was literally on the brink of being thrown out onto the street by commercial debt collectors, decided to march into my $2.5 million penthouse and demand I pay her rent. They thought they could bully me, shame me, and manipulate my sense of obligation to the Sterling legacy into footing the exact bill required to save her house. They wanted me to pay the mortgage on the house she was losing, to cover the loan her sons had defaulted on, to subsidize the fake business her daughter-in-law was running, all while I was simultaneously funding Jamal's fake tech company. And they wanted me to thank them for the privilege. I was not a wife to Jamal. I was not a daughter-in-law to Loretta. I was a host organism. I was a financial parasite's ultimate prize. A cold, hollow laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the empty room. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally stepped completely out of the fog of emotional manipulation and into the blinding light of reality. For 2 years, I had bent over backwards trying to prove my worth to a family that had absolutely no worth of their own. I had tolerated their microaggressions, their snide remarks about my background, and their endless posturing, because I believed that beneath the pretentiousness, there was a genuine family unit. But there was no family. There was only a syndicate of desperate broke con artists holding each other up like a house of cards. I thought back to the dinner table. I thought about Mackenzie draped in her earthy fabrics, looking me dead in the eye and lecturing me about Black generational wealth and toxic individualism. She had the unmitigated gall to tone police me while fully knowing that the only reason her mother-in-law was not living in a motel was because they planned to extort my hard-earned tech salary. She had weaponized my race and my success to guilt-trip me into paying off her commercial failures. And Jamal, my husband. He sat there and sipped his wine, playing the part of the reluctant peacemaker. He watched his mother demand money from me, knowing full well that if I did not pay that invoice, his mother would lose her home because of his signature on a bad loan. He was willing to gaslight me, demean me, and break every vow he ever made just to cover up his own spectacular incompetence. I closed the PDF and opened a fresh email draft addressed to my legal team. The divorce was going to be swift, but the financial devastation I was about to unleash on the Sterling family was going to be absolute. I attached the commercial loan documents, the foreclosure notices, and the fake rent invoice Loretta had presented to me at dinner. I instructed my attorneys to draft a formal notification to the shadow bank explicitly stating that Jamal Sterling had been utilizing misappropriated corporate funds from my LLC to make any previous payments on that loan. By freezing his access to my accounts, I was effectively pulling the plug on their only source of capital. Loretta was not just going to lose the battle of egos in my dining room. She was going to lose her house. The bank was going to seize her pristine suburban estate, and she was going to have to explain to all her high society friends why her antique furniture was sitting on the curb. Jamal, the man who had promised to protect and cherish me, was about to face a mountain of commercial debt with zero income, a ruined credit score, and a civil lawsuit for embezzlement. Malik and Mackenzie would be right there beside him, completely exposed and entirely bankrupt. I hit send on the email, watching the progress bar shoot across the screen. The message vanished into cyberspace, carrying the absolute destruction of the Sterling family with it. I closed my laptop and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Atlanta skyline was fully illuminated now, a sprawling grid of lights and ambition. I had built my empire in this city. I had laid every brick, negotiated every contract, and earned every single dollar in my accounts through my own brilliance. The Sterling family had tried to hijack my empire to save their sinking ship, but they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I was not a rescue boat. I was the iceberg, and they had just steered full speed into my hull. 3 days passed, 72 hours of absolute, uninterrupted peace. I spent those days in the pristine environment of my corporate office, surrounded by the quiet hum of actual productivity. My legal team had executed my instructions with terrifying efficiency. The personal and corporate accounts Jamal had previously enjoyed access to were completely frozen. The civil suit documents were drafted and making their way through the proper channels. I had effectively severed the financial umbilical cord that kept the Sterling family floating above their own ruin. I knew it was only a matter of time before the reality of a $0 bank balance and a looming commercial default sent someone crawling to my doorstep. I just did not expect the performance to be quite this pathetic. I was sitting in my corner office on the 40th floor reviewing the architectural blueprints for a new commercial development when the phone on my desk chimed. It was my receptionist, David. His voice was tight with uncomfortable urgency. He informed me that my husband was down in the main lobby causing a minor scene. According to David, Jamal was pacing near the security turnstiles, looking visibly distressed, carrying a massive bouquet of flowers, and begging the security guards to let him upstairs to see his wife. A lesser woman might have instructed security to escort him off the premises. A woman still hurt by a broken heart might have gone down there to scream at him in front of the morning commuters. But I was operating on a completely different frequency now. I was a grandmaster studying a chessboard, and my opponent had just moved his king directly into the line of fire. I told David to hold him in the lobby and that I would be right down. I smoothed my tailored skirt, checked my reflection in the glass of my office door to ensure my expression was perfectly neutral, and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. When the elevator doors parted, I stepped into the sprawling, sunlit expanse of my corporate building. It was a cathedral of modern capitalism, all brushed steel glass and polished stone. And standing right in the middle of it, looking entirely out of place, was Jamal. The physical toll of 3 days without my financial protection was glaringly obvious. He was wearing a suit, but it was slightly wrinkled, as if he had pulled it out of a hastily packed suitcase, living out of the back of his car, or crashing on Malik's couch. He looked exhausted. The arrogant swagger he carried in my penthouse was completely gone. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot. In his hands, he clutched a massive, absurdly expensive arrangement of long-stem red roses. I immediately wondered which maxed-out credit card he had used to purchase them, or if he had simply manipulated a florist the way he tried to manipulate me. As soon as he saw me approaching the security desk, Jamal practically shoved past the guard. He rushed toward me, stopping just a few feet away, his chest heaving as if he had run a marathon. He looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Maya," he breathed, his voice cracking with a manufactured vulnerability. "Thank God you came down. I have been trying to call you for 3 days. You blocked my number. I did not know what else to do. I had to see you." I stood perfectly still, maintaining a polite distance. I did not reach for the roses. I simply looked at him and allowed the silence to stretch, forcing him to squirm under the weight of my unyielding gaze. "Please." Maya. Jamal continued, taking a hesitant step closer. His eyes filled with actual wet tears. It was a spectacular display of weaponized emotion. "I am so sorry. I have not slept since Tuesday night. I have just been sitting in my car thinking about how badly I messed up. You have to believe me, I never wanted that dinner to happen. I never wanted my mother to hand you that invoice." I raised a single perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "You seemed very supportive of her invoice when you told me to stop making a scene and just pay the rent." Jamal shook his head vigorously, a tear actually spilling over his lashes and tracking down his cheek. He reached out with one hand, offering the heavy bouquet of roses like a peace offering to a hostile deity. "I was scared, Maya. I was intimidated. You have to understand the pressure I am under with my family. My mother is just so old-fashioned. She comes from a different generation, a different mindset. She does not understand the modern dynamic of a successful woman like you. She gets these grand ideas about the sterling legacy, and she bullies us into playing along." I was terrified of confronting her in the moment. "I panicked and I took it out on you. It was the biggest mistake of my entire life." I listened to him shift the blame with absolute awe. He was standing in my corporate lobby, actively facing commercial foreclosure and the complete destruction of his fake business, and he was blaming his mother's old-fashioned mindset. He was pretending that he was just a helpless, intimidated son caught in the crossfire of his mother's traditional values. He conveniently omitted the part where he forged loan documents, stole my corporate funds to pay for his brother's yoga studio, and plotted to extort me to save their childhood home. He wanted me to believe he was a victim. "I should have defended you," Jamal whispered, his voice dropping an octave to convey deep, soulful regret. "You are my wife. You are the most brilliant, beautiful, capable woman I have ever met. I was just so insecure about my own business failing that I let them tear you down to make myself feel bigger. I was wrong, Maya. I am a broken man without you. I just want my wife back. I want to make our marriage work." I looked into his tearful eyes. I saw the desperate calculating machine whirring frantically behind them. He had checked his bank accounts. He had received the notification from the shadow bank that the corporate funnel had been shut off. The foreclosure clock was ticking down to the final hour. He needed access to my vault, and he needed it today. He was betting everything on the assumption that I was a typical, emotionally driven woman who could be swayed by a few tears, a tragic confession of male insecurity, and a bouquet of red roses. He thought I was weak. He thought I was starved for his validation. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I let out a long, slow breath, allowing my rigid posture to relax. I untensed my shoulders. I uncrossed my arms. I looked down at the marble floor for a brief moment, as if I were wrestling with my own heartbreak, and then I looked back up at him. I softened my eyes, replacing the icy glare with a look of tired, reluctant affection. I reached out and gently took the heavy bouquet of roses from his hands. Jamal let out a sharp, audible exhale, the tension rushing out of his body. He genuinely thought he had just pulled off the greatest emotional heist of his life. "It has been a really hard few days, Jamal," I said, making sure my voice trembled just a fraction of an inch. "I was so hurt by what happened. I felt like you chose them over me." "I did not," he replied eagerly, taking a step closer and risking a gentle hand on my arm. "I choose you, Maya. I will always choose you. I just need a chance to prove it." Let me prove that I can be the husband you deserve. I looked down at his hand on my arm, suppressing the profound urge to sanitize my skin. I looked back up at him, offering a small, fragile smile. Words are easy, Jamal, I whispered, playing the part of the wounded but hopeful wife to absolute perfection. If we are going to fix this, it cannot just be a conversation in a lobby. There needs to be real accountability. Your family disrespected me in my own home. If we are going to move forward and be a team again, we need to clear the air with everyone. Jamal nodded eagerly, completely blind to the trap I was laying right at his feet. Anything, Maya. Whatever you want. You name it. I want a reconciliation meeting, I said, keeping my tone soft and collaborative. I want to sit down with your mother, Malik, and Mackenzie. I want us to meet at your mother's house this weekend. I want us all in one room, and I want to hear everyone apologize and agree on how we move forward as a united front. If we can do that, if we can really lay everything on the table and be honest with each other, then we can talk about coming home and figuring out the finances. Jamal's eyes lit up with a triumphant, greedy spark that he tried desperately to hide behind his mask of contrition. He heard the magic words. Figuring out the finances. In his mind, he had just secured the bailout. He believed that if he could just get me into a room with his family, they could stroke my ego, offer a few fake apologies, and I would open my checkbook to save his mother's suburban estate. I will make it happen, Jamal promised, his voice practically vibrating with relief. I will call my mother right now. We will set it up for Saturday afternoon. I promise you, Maya, they will apologize. Everything is going to change. I smiled, pulling the roses a little closer to my chest. I know it will, Jamal. I will see you on Saturday. Send me the time. I turned around and walked back toward the private elevators. I did not look back, but I could feel his arrogant, victorious smirk burning into my spine from across the lobby. He honestly thought he had manipulated me back into submission. He thought he had played the system and won. He had no idea that I was not agreeing to a reconciliation meeting. I was setting the stage for an execution. Kicking him out of the penthouse was a private victory, but the Sterling family's pride was rooted in their public image, their suburban fortress, and their fake legacy. Taking them down one by one was not enough. I needed them all in the same room. I needed them sitting in the very house they were trying to steal my money to save. The roses felt heavy in my arms. I stepped into the elevator, swiped my keycard, and waited for the doors to slide shut. As soon as the metal sealed me inside the private cabin, I dropped the entire bouquet directly into the corner trash bin. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to my legal team and Marcus. Get the foreclosure documents ready for final delivery. We are crashing a family gathering this weekend. The moment the delivery confirmation for my text message appeared on the screen, I set my phone face down on the polished mahogany of my desk. The trap was set for Saturday, but simply showing up to a fake reconciliation meeting with foreclosure documents felt entirely insufficient. Delivering bad news is one thing. Being the architect of that bad news is a completely different level of power. I did not just want to watch Loretta lose her house to a faceless corporation. I wanted to be the entity that took it from her. I swiveled my chair around to face the panoramic windows of my office. My mind shifted gears, transitioning from the emotional theater of the lobby to the cold, mathematical reality of commercial real estate. In my line of work, distressed assets are traded every single day. When a borrower defaults on a high-risk commercial loan, the secondary lender holding that note rarely wants to go through the messy, drawn-out process of a physical foreclosure and property auction. They want liquidity. They want to offload the bad debt to a debt buyer, cut their losses, and clear their balance sheets. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the speed dial for Marcus. He answered immediately. I thought we were done for the day, Maya. The civil suits are filed and Jamal's accounts are frozen solid. What else could you possibly need? I need to make a purchase, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. The mezzanine credit firm holding the note on Loretta's suburban estate. I want to buy the debt. There was a heavy, profound silence on the other end of the line. Marcus was a man who dealt with aggressive corporate takeovers on a weekly basis, but even he was momentarily stunned by the sheer ruthlessness of the request. You want to buy the non-performing loan? Marcus clarified, his voice laced with a mixture of shock and deep professional respect. You do not just want them evicted, you want to be the bank. Exactly, I replied. Jamal and his mother wanted to play landlord and tenant with me. I think it is only fair that I show them how the game is actually played. I want to hold the promissory note. I want the deed of trust. I want the absolute legal authority to initiate the foreclosure auction myself. Marcus let out a low whistle. It is highly unorthodox for a family member to purchase distressed debt on a relative's property, Maya. If the shadow bank knows it is you, they might inflate the price or refuse the sale, fearing a legal entanglement during the divorce proceedings. That is why they will not know it is me, I countered smoothly. We are not going to use Caldwell Premier Holdings or any entity associated with my primary corporate structure. 3 years ago, I registered a blind holding company in Wyoming called Apex Horizon Equities for a commercial acquisition that ultimately fell through. It has a completely sterilized paper trail. My name does not appear on any of the public registry documents. The registered agent is a corporate proxy service. I want you to use Apex Horizon to approach the lender. Marcus was already typing rapidly, the sound of his keyboard echoing over the speakerphone. What is your ceiling for the purchase? The outstanding balance on the loan, including all of Jamal and Malik's late fees, penalties, and back taxes, is roughly $850,000, I stated, having memorized the foreclosure documents earlier that week. Offer them $900,000 in cash. A clean wire transferred unconditional buyout. They are a shadow bank dealing with a deeply toxic asset. If we offer them a premium cash buyout to wash their hands of a defaulting yoga studio and a fake tech CEO, they will sign the paperwork by tomorrow morning. Consider the offer submitted, Marcus said. I will have our acquisitions team draft the purchase agreement immediately. I will call you the second the ink is dry. I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, allowing a slow, deeply satisfied smile to spread across my face. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in high-speed financial maneuvering. Behind the scenes, completely hidden from the Sterling family's radar, my wealth management team executed a flawless corporate strike. The secondary lender was absolutely thrilled to offload the toxic debt. They did not ask questions about Apex Horizon Equities. They did not care who was buying the note as long as the wire transfer cleared their clearinghouse. To them, it was just another distressed asset moving off their books. To me, it was the ultimate instrument of justice. By Thursday afternoon, the transaction was officially complete. Marcus sent over the encrypted digital dossier containing the original promissory note, the deed of trust, and the assignment of the mortgage. I printed the documents out on heavy, high-quality legal paper. I ran my fingers over the embossed seals and the transfer signatures. It was official. Jamal, Malik, and Loretta no longer owed their massive predatory debt to a faceless corporation. They owed it entirely to me. I was the bank. I held the keys to the pristine suburban fortress Loretta used to host her snobby bridge club. I possessed the absolute legal authority to order the sheriff to chain the front doors and drag her antique furniture onto the front lawn. The irony was almost too poetic to bear. For years, Loretta had looked down her nose at my working-class background. She had proudly flaunted her home as a symbol of her generational wealth, using it as a prop to make me feel small and insignificant. She had raised her sons to believe they were inherently better than me, simply because of their last name and the zip code they grew up in. And in a desperate bid to maintain that very illusion, they had unknowingly handed the deed to their entire legacy directly into my hands. I placed the documents carefully into a sleek black leather portfolio. This was the centerpiece for my upcoming weekend performance. Jamal was currently running around the city, likely borrowing money from whoever he had left, trying to look presentable for our fake reconciliation meeting. He thought he had successfully manipulated his heartbroken wife. He thought he had bought his family enough time to secure the bailout they desperately needed. He had no idea that the bailout had already happened, but he was no longer the beneficiary. Friday passed with a serene, terrifying quiet. I went to the gym, I attended my scheduled board meetings, and I finalized the closing on a new commercial property in Midtown. I operated with the pristine focus of a woman who had meticulously tied off every single loose end. Jamal sent me a few text messages throughout the day, sickeningly sweet messages talking about how much he missed me and how excited he was to heal our family on Saturday. I did not respond. I just let the silence amplify his desperate false hope. When Saturday morning finally arrived, I woke up feeling remarkably refreshed. I took my time getting ready. I chose my outfit with deliberate surgical precision. I bypassed the accommodating muted tones I usually wore around his mother. Instead, I selected a sharply tailored crimson-red blazer and a matching pencil skirt. It was the exact outfit I wore when I closed my first multi-million-dollar real estate deal. It was armor. I slipped on a pair of designer stiletto heels, grabbed my black leather portfolio, and walked out to my car. The drive to Loretta's suburban estate took 45 minutes. I navigated the winding, tree-lined streets of her exclusive neighborhood, past the manicured lawns and the sprawling driveways. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of the Sterling residence. The house sat at the end of a long, sweeping driveway, a towering monument to a family that was completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. I parked my car, stepped out into the warm afternoon air, and gripped the leather portfolio tightly in my right hand. The time for pretending was officially over. The bank had arrived to collect. I walked up the sweeping brick pathway to the front entrance of the Sterling estate, my heels clicking sharply against the masonry. Up close, the illusion of their generational wealth was already showing its cracks. The paint on the massive colonial pillars was beginning to peel, and the perfectly manicured hedges could not hide the fact that the custom water fountain in the center of the driveway had been completely drained and shut off. They could not even afford the water bill to keep their lawn ornaments running, yet they were sitting inside, waiting to extort me. I pressed the glowing button on the doorbell. The heavy melodic chimes echoed deep inside the house. Less than 10 seconds later, the heavy oak door swung open. Jamal stood in the entryway dressed in a crisp linen shirt and tailored slacks, trying to project the image of a relaxed, forgiving husband. When his eyes landed on my crimson blazer and matching skirt, a brief flash of hesitation crossed his features. He had expected me to show up in soft, accommodating clothing, perhaps with a tearful apology already waiting on my lips. My sharp, unapologetic armor threw him off balance, but his desperate need for my money quickly overrode his intuition. "Thank you for coming, Maya," he said, letting out a heavy manufactured sigh of relief. He reached out, attempting to place a welcoming hand on the small of my back to guide me inside. I stepped smoothly out of his reach, stepping over the threshold without a single word. I did not break my stride as I walked through the grand foyer, my eyes scanning the imported Persian rugs and the crystal chandelier hanging above the curved staircase. It was a beautiful home, undeniably so, but the energy inside the walls was thick with suffocating desperation and unearned arrogance. I made my way directly into the formal living room. The scene waiting for me was perfectly choreographed, a masterclass in high society intimidation. Loretta sat directly in the center of the plush, oversized velvet sofa, playing the role of the benevolent but stern matriarch. She was sipping tea from a delicate china cup. Her posture rigid, her chin lifted in a display of supreme superiority. Malik stood by the stone fireplace, swirling a glass of amber liquid that he likely poured from a bottle he could not afford to replace. Mackenzie sat neatly in a wingback chair adjacent to the sofa, her legs crossed, holding a sleek leather binder in her lap. They all looked up as I entered. No one offered me a seat. No one offered me a drink. They were deliberately attempting to make me feel like a subordinate who had been called into the principal's office for a disciplinary hearing. Maya Loretta began setting her teacup down on the matching saucer with a delicate clink. "I am glad Jamal was able to talk some sense into you. We were all deeply disappointed by your erratic behavior at the penthouse, but as a family we believe in grace. We understand that new money can sometimes cause people to lose their grounding. We are willing to put your outburst behind us, provided you are ready to align yourself with the structure of this household." I stopped in the center of the room, planting my stilettos firmly into their expensive rug. I kept my black leather portfolio tucked securely under my right arm. I did not sit down. I simply looked at Loretta, allowing a blank, perfectly serene expression to settle over my features. "I am completely grounded, Loretta," I replied. my voice smooth and echoing clearly in the large room. In fact, I have never seen things more clearly than I do right now. Jamal moved to stand behind his mother's sofa, crossing his arms over his chest in an attempt to look authoritative. "That is exactly what we want to hear, Maya," he said, using his best boardroom voice. "We all want this marriage to work. We want to move forward. But for that to happen, we need to establish some concrete boundaries and expectations. We cannot have you using your corporate accounts as a weapon every time you feel insecure." Insecure. The sheer projection in his choice of words was staggering. He was a man standing in a home that was actively being seized by a shadow bank, lecturing the woman who held the deed to his entire existence about insecurity. Mackenzie leaned forward in her wingback chair, adjusting her chunky silver necklaces. She offered me a soft, deeply patronizing smile. "Maya, we really want to create a safe, equitable space for everyone in this family," she said, her voice dripping with artificial therapy jargon. "When you hide your assets and refuse to participate in the shared ecosystem of the Sterling legacy, it creates a trauma response for Jamal. It forces him to operate from a place of scarcity. We have spent the last 3 days working on a framework that will help you transition from a mindset of toxic individualism into a mindset of community wealth building." She opened the leather binder in her lap, retrieved a single sheet of paper, and stood up. She walked over to the massive mahogany coffee table separating us and slid the document directly across the polished wood until it stopped right in front of me. "We drafted this to give you a sense of accountability," Mackenzie explained, stepping back to her chair and sitting down with a deeply satisfied, smug expression. "It is a formal commitment. It will help you stay aligned with your financial obligations to your husband and to the family trust." I looked down at the document resting on the coffee table. I did not reach for it immediately. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the heavy, expectant tension of the room. Then very slowly I leaned forward and picked up the piece of paper. It was a lease, a literal standard form residential lease agreement that they had clearly downloaded and printed for free off the internet. The formatting was entirely generic, the font was uninspired, and the blank spaces had been hastily filled in with a blue ballpoint pen. I read the text, my eyes scanning the absurdly lazy legal jargon. The landlord was listed as the Sterling Family Trust. The tenant was listed as Maya Caldwell Sterling. The property in question was the exact address of the downtown penthouse that I legally owned in its entirety. But the absolute crowning jewel of this pathetic extortion attempt was written on the third line under the payment terms. They had boldly written in the required monthly rental amount, $6,700, due on the first of every month, payable directly to a bank routing number that I immediately recognized as belonging to Loretta's personal checking account. They had even included a handwritten clause stating that a $500 late fee would be applied if the funds were not wired by the 5th of the month. I stood in the center of Loretta's living room, holding the most ridiculous piece of paper I had ever seen in my professional career. They were completely serious. They had brought me to this house, sat me down in front of a tribunal of financial parasites, and handed me a fake lease for my own property to extort the exact amount of money required to stop the foreclosure on the roof currently over our heads. Jamal took a step forward, his voice softening into a manipulative, pleading tone. "Just sign it, Maya. It formalizes our arrangement. It proves to my mother that you are committed to the family, and it gives us a fresh start. Once you sign that, I will pack my bags and we can go back to the penthouse tonight. We can go back to being a power couple." I looked up from the fake lease and let my gaze sweep across the room. Malik was swirling his scotch, looking entirely too pleased with himself. Mackenzie was smiling her culturally aware savior smile. Loretta was sitting on her velvet throne, her chin raised fully, expecting me to pull a pen from my purse and sign my financial independence away to save my crumbling marriage. They honestly believed they had broken my spirit. They thought the 3 days of silence had worn me down, that the threat of losing Jamal had forced me into submission. They thought I was a desperate, lonely woman who would gladly pay $6,700 a month just to keep a useless man in my bed and a fake family in my life. I held their pathetic internet-generated lease agreement in my left hand. In my right hand, I held my heavy black leather portfolio. The portfolio containing the fully executed, legally binding commercial promissory note, the deed of trust, and the assignment of the mortgage for the very estate we were standing inside. I let them enjoy their final fleeting seconds of ignorant bliss. I let them savor the illusion of their victory. I looked at Jamal, then at Loretta, and I allowed a slow, chilling smile to spread across my face. I looked down at the flimsy piece of printer paper in my left hand. I brought my right hand over, still clutching my leather portfolio securely against my side, and gripped the edge of the fake lease. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the paper right down the center. The sharp, tearing sound sliced through the heavy silence of the living room like a physical blade. I stacked the two halves together and tore them again, reducing their pathetic extortion attempt to confetti. I let the shredded pieces flutter from my fingers, watching them drift down to rest on Loretta's imported Persian rug. Loretta gasped, her rigid posture instantly breaking as she recoiled into the cushions of her velvet sofa. Mackenzie's self-satisfied smile melted right off her face, replaced by wide-eyed, open-mouthed shock. Jamal took a stumbling step backward, the false authoritative confidence completely draining from his body. "You really thought this would work?" I said, keeping my voice pitched at a conversational, deadly calm level. "You honestly believed that after 3 days of silence, I was sitting in my penthouse crying over a man who cannot even afford to pay his own cell phone bill? You thought you had broken my spirit. You thought you could summon me to your home, surround me with this tribunal of financial parasites, and bully me into funding your sinking ship." I unzipped the top of my black leather portfolio. I reached inside and pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder containing the heavily notarized documents from Apex Horizon Equities. I stepped forward and dropped the folder directly onto the massive mahogany coffee table. It hit the polished wood with a heavy, resounding thud that made Loretta's delicate china teacup rattle against its saucer. "Playtime is officially over," I announced. I looked directly at Loretta, pinning her under a gaze so absolute and unyielding that she actually flinched. $6,700, I said, pronouncing every single syllable with surgical precision. "It is a very specific number, Loretta. It is not the market rate for a luxury downtown penthouse. It is not a standard maintenance fee for a family trust. Do you want to tell the room what that number actually represents, or should I do the honors?" Loretta opened her mouth, but her throat seemed to have closed up entirely. She looked at Jamal, sheer, unfiltered panic flaring in her eyes. She was a woman who had spent her entire life hiding behind the facade of generational wealth, and she suddenly realized that I possessed the X-ray vision required to see right through the drywall of her illusions. I turned my gaze to Malik, who had gone perfectly still by the stone fireplace. The glass of cheap scotch was literally trembling in his hand. He knew. He knew exactly what was inside that manila folder. "I will save you the trouble." I continued pacing slowly around the edge of the coffee table. $6,700 is the exact monthly payment required by a high-risk mezzanine commercial credit firm to pause the active foreclosure proceedings on this very house. Mackenzie frowned, her brow furrowing in genuine bewildered confusion. She looked from me to her husband, her chunky silver necklaces clinking as she shifted in her wingback chair. "Foreclosure," Mackenzie stammered. "Malik, what is she talking about? Your mother owns this house free and clear. The estate is paid off." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed against the high ceilings. "Nothing in this family is paid off, Mackenzie. 2 years ago, your husband and Jamal took out a massive predatory commercial loan to keep your fraudulent organic lifestyle brand from completely capsizing. Because neither of your brilliant sterling men had any actual liquid assets to put up as collateral, Loretta stepped in to play the hero. She leveraged this pristine suburban fortress to secure the capital for your fake healing crystals and your imported yoga mats, and then, spectacularly predictably, they defaulted on the loan." Jamal lunged forward, raising his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Maya, stop. Please do not do this right now. We can handle this privately. We can talk about this, just the two of us." I held up a single hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Do not interrupt me while I am delivering your financial autopsy, Jamal. You brought me into this room to extort me. You sat me down in front of your family to demand I pay your debts under the guise of saving our marriage. You weaponized my vows. You do not get to ask for privacy now that the spotlight is burning you alive. I pointed down at the thick manila folder resting on the coffee table. The bank came knocking, Loretta. You received the notice of default. You received the intent to foreclose. The shadow bank demanded $6,700 a month to keep them from chaining these front doors shut and dragging your antique furniture out onto the curb. That is the exact amount you tried to squeeze out of me with your pathetic internet-generated lease agreement. You viewed me as a convenient, unsuspecting ATM to bail out your sons and save your social standing. Loretta's face turned a violent mottled shade of red. She gripped the armrests of her velvet sofa, her knuckles turning bone white. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of her absolute humiliation. "You are a bitter, vindictive liar. We are the Sterling family. We do not default on our obligations. My sons are successful executives. You are just trying to destroy us because you are jealous of our legacy. Your legacy is a mountain of commercial debt and a failing yoga studio." I shot back, my voice slicing through her hysterical denial. "And I do not need to lie, Loretta. The proof is sitting right in front of you. Open the folder." Nobody moved. Malik looked like he was about to be physically sick. Mackenzie was staring at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror, realizing that her culturally aware, holistic business was the literal reason her mother-in-law was about to be homeless. Jamal was staring at the floor, his chest heaving, his entire world collapsing around his ears. "Open the folder," I commanded, raising my voice just enough to rattle the crystal chandelier above us. With a shaking, hesitant hand, Jamal finally reached forward. He flipped open the heavy manila cover. The first page, resting on top of the stack, was the commercial promissory note. The second page was the assignment of the mortgage. He stared at the documents, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched his brain try to process the information, trying to understand why I was in possession of original bank documents from a secondary commercial lender. I looked at the matriarch of the Sterling family, watching her cling desperately to the shattered pieces of her illusion. I did not feel an ounce of pity for her. I did not feel an ounce of pity for any of them. I felt the pure, unadulterated satisfaction of a woman who was about to deliver the final lethal blow to a syndicate of parasites who had mistaken my grace for weakness. Jamal stared at the dense legal text, his eyes darting frantically across the page as his brain misfired. He was desperately trying to comprehend how his wife, the woman he thought he had successfully bullied into submission just minutes ago, was standing in his mother's living room holding the original shadow bank foreclosure documents. He opened his mouth, searching for a lie, an excuse, or a deflection, but I was not going to let him control the narrative for a single second. I reached back into my black leather portfolio and pulled out 3 thick, professionally bound booklets. Marcus, my forensic accountant, had worked overtime to ensure every single illicit transaction, every hidden debt, and every fraudulent wire transfer was perfectly tabbed, highlighted, and summarized. I tossed the first booklet onto the mahogany coffee table right in front of Loretta. I handed the second directly to Malik, who took it with a trembling hand, his eyes wide with impending dread. I walked the third booklet over to Mackenzie and dropped it squarely into her lap, right on top of her earthy, sustainable fabric skirt. "Those are the forensic accounting reports," I announced, stepping back to take in the full view of my captive audience. "I suggest you open them. Since we are all so deeply committed to building Black generational wealth and maintaining financial transparency, we are going to have a highly transparent conversation about your family's entire financial ecosystem." No one moved. They stared at the bound booklets as if they were live grenades. "Let us start with you, Mackenzie," I said, my voice sharp and commanding. "Open your booklet to page 4. It is entirely dedicated to aura and earth wellness." Mackenzie's hands shook visibly as she flipped the heavy cover open. She stared down at the highlighted spreadsheets, her face draining of all color. "You sat at my dining table and lectured me about hoarding wealth." I continued pacing slowly behind the sofa to ensure my voice projected clearly. "You told me I was suffering from toxic individualism, but page 4 clearly shows that your luxury organic lifestyle brand is a catastrophic failure. You have been importing synthetic rocks, factory-molded plastic crystals, and chemically scented oils from overseas wholesale sweatshops. You mark them up 1,000%, slap a minimalist beige label on them, and you are still hemorrhaging tens of thousands of dollars a month. Your entire ethical, culturally aware business is a complete scam, and it is entirely bankrupt. Mackenzie let out a choked, wet sob, shaking her head in frantic denial. She looked up at her husband, her socially conscious facade crumbling into absolute panic. Malik said we were turning a profit, she whispered, tears spilling over her eyelashes. He told me the new marketing campaign was working. He said the community was responding to my vision. Malik lied to you, I said, turning my gaze to her husband, just like he lied to his mother. Turn to page 12, Loretta. Loretta snapped her head toward me, her eyes burning with a mixture of terror and outrage. She reached forward with trembling fingers and flipped the pages of her booklet. Page 12 is the commercial loan origination document, I explained, watching her eyes scan the highlighted text. Malik was so desperate to fund his wife's vanity project and maintain his status as a high society entrepreneur that he convinced you to sign over the deed to this exact house as collateral for a predatory commercial loan. He bet the roof over your head on imported fake sage and cheap yoga mats, and he lost spectacularly. Loretta's head snapped toward her oldest son. The sheer unhinged fury radiating from her posture was genuinely terrifying. You told me that was a bridge loan for a guaranteed commercial real estate flip, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of his monumental betrayal. You said the return on investment would double my retirement portfolio. You used my house to pay for her failing crystal shop. Malik held his hands up defensively, backing away from the stone fireplace, as if his mother might actually lunge at him. Mom, listen to me. The market shifted abruptly, he stammered, sweating profusely. The supply chain issues ruined our retail margins. We just needed a little more time to rebrand the studio and drive foot traffic. I was going to pay you back. There is no more time, I interrupted smoothly, cutting off his pathetic excuses. Which brings us to the golden boy. Page 22. I looked directly at my husband, who was currently staring at the floor, wishing the hardwood would open up and swallow him whole. Jamal did not just lie to me about being a visionary tech CEO, I announced to the room. He lied to all of you. His company has not generated a single dollar of revenue in over 2 years. His credit score is exactly 580. He is drowning in secondary personal loans and maxed out credit cards. The only reason he has been able to buy you Rolex watches, Loretta, and fund your luxury trips to Cabo is because he was secretly using my corporate accounts. He has been playing the role of the wealthy benefactor using my blood, sweat, and tears. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in silent, humiliated defeat. But even my money was not enough to save you. I continued, bringing the final devastating piece of the puzzle into the light. When the shadow bank initiated the pre-foreclosure on this house, Jamal panicked. He knew I audited my accounts regularly. He knew he could not siphon $6,700 a month without me noticing. So the four of you sat down and concocted that pathetic, insulting fake lease agreement. You tried to gaslight me into paying the exact monthly installment required to keep the bank from seizing this property. You tried to extort me to cover up your spectacular failures. The living room immediately descended into absolute vicious chaos. It was like dropping a lit match into a fireworks factory. The loyalty they claimed to possess vanished the second the illusion of money disappeared. Loretta threw her heavy copy of the accounting report directly at Malik's chest. It hit him with a loud smack, scattering loose papers across the floor. You ruined my life, she screamed, her voice tearing through the house. You destroyed the sterling legacy for this pathetic, mediocre woman and her fake rocks. I am going to be homeless because of you, Malik yelled back, his own face contorted with rage, accusing his mother of being a financial drain who was too busy trying to impress her country club friends to actually read the loan documents she signed. You wanted the lifestyle, Mom, he shouted over her screams. You wanted to brag about your sons being executives. You signed the papers because you are just as greedy as the rest of us. Mackenzie burst into loud theatrical tears, dropping her face into her hands. She accused Malik of financially abusing her by hiding the truth about their business operations. She then turned her venom on Jamal, sobbing hysterically and screaming that if he was a real tech executive, he could have just bailed them out legitimately instead of dragging her into a massive fraud scheme that was going to ruin her public reputation. Jamal shouted over all of them, completely losing his temper. He blamed his mother for putting so much pressure on him to be wealthy, claiming he only stole from me because Loretta made him feel like an absolute failure if he was not driving a luxury car and funding their vacations. He screamed that they had ruined his marriage by forcing him to present that stupid rent invoice. I stood silently at the edge of the living room, my arms crossed over my crimson blazer, watching the glorious, chaotic destruction of the Sterling family. They were ripping each other to shreds, screaming vicious insults, airing decades of toxic family grievances, and tearing away every last shred of their manufactured dignity. They were turning on each other like starving wolves trapped in a cage. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to argue or defend myself. I had simply handed them the unvarnished truth, and the truth was burning their entire fake empire to the ground right before my eyes. I let the shouting wash over me for another full minute. I watched the ugly, visceral reality of their dysfunction spill out onto the Persian rug. The Sterling family, stripped of my money, was nothing more than a snake pit of resentments and fragile egos. When Malik finally shoved past his weeping wife to retrieve his glass of scotch, and Loretta sank back onto her velvet sofa, gasping for breath, the room fell into a tense, exhausted silence. They turned to look at me, their faces flushed and eyes wide with the realization that I was still standing there. I had not fled. I had not broken down. I was simply observing them with the detached clinical interest of a scientist studying a particularly aggressive strain of bacteria. I unzipped the final compartment of my black leather portfolio. I pulled out the heavy embossed document that I had personally printed the day before. The paper was crisp, the ink dark and absolute. I did not toss it like I had the accounting reports. I walked slowly to the coffee table and placed it down with immense care, centering it perfectly between Loretta and Jamal. You all spent a considerable amount of energy trying to convince me to pay for the privilege of being a part of this family, I said, my voice dropping to a low, quiet register that forced them all to lean in to hear me. You fabricated a lease. You lectured me on Black generational wealth. You tried to extort $6,700 from me to stop a shadow bank from foreclosing on this suburban estate. I tapped my index finger against the embossed seal on the document. What you failed to consider? I continued, my gaze locking onto Loretta's terrified eyes, is that the shadow bank you owed this money to is a business. And businesses like liquidity. They prefer cash over drawn-out, messy foreclosure proceedings. So when an anonymous holding company approached them yesterday morning, offering a premium, unconditional cash buyout for a highly toxic, defaulted commercial note, they were absolutely thrilled to sign the paperwork. Loretta's breath hitched in her throat. Her eyes darted from my face down to the document on the table. Jamal leaned over his eyes, scanning the dense legal text. I watched his brain try to process the information, trying to understand what he was looking at. It is an assignment of mortgage, I explained, simplifying the legal jargon for their benefit. As of 9 o'clock yesterday morning, Apex Horizon Equities officially acquired the defaulted note on this property. I am the sole managing member of Apex Horizon Equities. The silence in the room was no longer just heavy. It was suffocating. It was the absolute crushing silence of total defeat. Loretta? I said, leaning over the table so my face was inches from hers. You do not own this property anymore. The bank does not own this property anymore. I do. I am the one holding the promissory note. I am the one holding the deed of trust. I am the bank. Loretta let out a small, strangled whimper. She looked at her sons, but neither of them moved. They were entirely powerless, completely stripped of any legal or financial standing. You wanted to charge me rent to save your home, I said, stepping back and smoothing the lapels of my crimson blazer. The irony is, you actually do have a landlord now. And as the new owner of this estate, I have evaluated the current market value and the outstanding commercial debt attached to it. The monthly carrying cost to keep this property from going to a public auction is exactly $6,700. I picked up the black leather portfolio, tucking it securely under my arm. I expect the first payment transferred by 5 o'clock on Friday, I announced, addressing the entire room. If the funds do not clear my corporate accounts by the end of the business day, I will immediately initiate the formal eviction process. The sheriff will be here on Monday morning to chain the doors and oversee the removal of your belongings. Jamal took a desperate, stumbling step toward me. Maya, please, he begged, his voice cracking. You cannot do this. Where is my mother supposed to go? She does not have anywhere else. That is an incredibly unfortunate situation for her, Jamal, I replied, not breaking my stride as I turned toward the foyer. But as you and your sister-in-law so eloquently explained to me, financial transparency and community wealth building are the cornerstones of the Sterling legacy. I am simply holding you all accountable to your own high standards. I walked out of the living room, leaving the four of them frozen in the absolute wreckage of their manufactured empire. I did not look back. I did not need to. I opened the heavy front door, stepped out into the warm Atlanta afternoon, and pulled it shut behind me with a firm, definitive click. The air smelled fresh, untainted by the suffocating stench of entitlement and lies. I walked down the sweeping brick pathway to my car, the sound of my stilettos ringing out like a victory march. I had entered that house as a target for extortion. I was leaving it as the undisputed owner. When Friday arrived, the $6,700 did not transfer. I had not expected it to. They were broke, desperate, and entirely out of options. At exactly 5 o'clock, I instructed my legal team to file the formal eviction notice. The divorce proceedings were brutal but swift. Jamal, stripped of my financial protection and facing impending civil suits for embezzlement, had absolutely no leverage to contest the prenuptial agreement. He signed the dissolution papers without a fight, likely hoping I would drop the fraud charges in exchange for his speedy exit from my life. I did not. Malik and Mackenzie's sustainable yoga studio filed for bankruptcy less than a month later. The civil suit I initiated for the recovery of embezzled funds completely drained whatever meager personal savings they had left. The holistic influencers Mackenzie relied upon publicly distanced themselves the moment the fraud allegations hit the local business journals. Her brand was utterly destroyed, exposed as a cheap, culturally appropriative scam subsidized by stolen money. As for Loretta, the eviction proceeded exactly as I had promised. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the county sheriff arrived at the suburban estate. The antique furniture she loved to brag about was carried out and deposited onto the manicured front lawn for the entire neighborhood to see. The grand matriarch of the Sterling family was forced to pack a few suitcases and move into a small rented apartment on the outskirts of the city, miles away from the country clubs and high society friends she had sacrificed everything to impress. I eventually sold the suburban estate to a young, hard-working couple who were thrilled to find such a beautiful property. The profit from the sale, combined with the successful recovery of the embezzled funds, more than compensated for the headache of dealing with the Sterling family. I returned to my penthouse, the real empire I had built with my own hands. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was just as spectacular as it had always been, but the air inside felt lighter, cleaner. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, walked over to the glass, and looked out over the glittering city skyline. I had survived their betrayal. I had dismantled their lies. And I had emerged stronger, sharper, and absolutely untouchable. What a fascinating story of taking back your power. Would you like to explore another scenario? Maybe a situation involving a workplace betrayal or a long-lost friend returning with an agenda. The fallout was fast, surgical, and absolutely merciless. Jamal, stripped of my corporate credit cards and desperately grasping at the fading ghost of his masculinity, tried to play the role of the scorned husband. He scrounged up enough borrowed cash to hire a flashy divorce attorney in Buckhead, fully expecting to drag me into a drawn-out legal battle for alimony and a massive cut of my real estate empire. He walked into that law office believing he was entitled to half of everything I had built with my own two hands. He walked out 30 minutes later with a profound understanding of his own stupidity. When his high-priced lawyer actually read the prenuptial agreement, the consultation came to a screeching halt. Jamal had been so consumed by his own ego, so desperate to maintain the illusion of the wealthy golden boy CEO, that he had signed the document 3 years ago without ever reading the fine print. He had waived his right to independent counsel because hiring a lawyer would have required admitting to me that he did not have the funds to pay a retainer. The prenup explicitly stated that in the event of a divorce, he waived all rights to spousal support, property division, and business equity. He walked into our marriage with a 580 credit score and a mountain of consumer debt, and the contract ensured he was walking out with exactly that and not a single penny more. He was left with absolutely nothing. While Jamal was receiving his devastating legal reality check, I was executing the final phase of my commercial takeover. Friday came and went. The $6,700 obviously never materialized in my holding company's accounts. I did not send a warning text. I did not call to gloat. I simply instructed my attorneys to file the writ of possession with the county court. The legal machinery moved with beautiful, unfeeling efficiency. On a crisp Tuesday morning, the county sheriff pulled up to the sweeping driveway of the Sterling family's beloved suburban fortress. Loretta had spent decades cultivating the image of an untouchable Atlanta socialite, using that house as the ultimate stage for her delusions of grandeur. Now the entire neighborhood watched from their manicured lawns as moving crews systematically dismantled her reality. The imported Persian rugs, the delicate china, and her prized antique furniture were unceremoniously carried out the front doors and deposited onto the curb. Loretta stood on the sidewalk clutching her designer handbag, sobbing hysterically as the locks were changed. There was no bridge club coming to save her. There was no generational wealth to cushion the fall. She was just another evicted tenant who failed to pay her landlord. Malik and Mackenzie were standing right there beside her, completely destitute. Without my money to artificially inflate their lifestyle, Mackenzie's fraudulent yoga studio went into immediate bankruptcy. They had lost their income, their fake spiritual brand, and now the roof over their heads. They had to pack their ethically sourced beige clothing into trash bags and figure out how to survive in a world that actually required them to work for a living. The trio was formally and publicly excised from the property I now owned. With his family entirely bankrupt and living out of budget motels, Jamal had no safety net to fall back on. He could not run to his mother. He could not crash in Malik's non-existent guest room. The man who had strutted around my $2.5 million penthouse acting like a corporate titan was forced to face the brutal reality of his actual income bracket. Without my pristine financial profile to back his rental applications, he was rejected from every luxury complex in the city. He ended up signing a lease on a cramped, noisy 400-square-foot studio apartment on the far side of town, right next to a loud highway overpass. There were no floor-to-ceiling windows. There were no imported marble countertops or private elevators. Just peeling linoleum, rattling pipes, and the crushing realization that he had thrown away an empire for the sake of his mother's ego. His high society image was not just fractured, it was completely obliterated. He had tried to treat me like a stepping stone to elevate his family of parasites, and in return I had shown him exactly what happens when you step out of line and plummet back down to the absolute bottom. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of my penthouse, letting the warm, fragrant Atlanta night air wash over me. The city skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a magnificent glowing grid of towering glass steel and raw ambition. Below me, the streets were a blur of red and white headlights, a constant river of motion that felt a million miles away from the perfect elevated sanctuary I had secured. I rested my hand against the cool metal of the railing and took a slow, deeply grounding breath. In my other hand, I held a crystal glass filled with a profoundly expensive, perfectly aged Cabernet. I swirled the dark crimson liquid, watching it cling to the sides of the glass, catching the reflections of the city lights. The silence up here was absolute luxury. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet that used to fill these rooms when Jamal was pacing the floors, pretending to be on vital conference calls with imaginary investors. It was a rich, triumphant peace. I had successfully purged my environment of every single parasite that had tried to attach itself to my success. I did not have to listen to Loretta's condescending remarks about high society etiquette. I did not have to endure Mackenzie's hypocritical word salad lectures about community resources. And most importantly, I never had to look at a man who was actively plotting my financial ruin while smiling to my face. I had protected my empire. Every brick, every contract, and every single dollar in my accounts remained fiercely, indisputably mine. Suddenly, the sharp, persistent vibration of my cell phone broke the stillness of the evening. The device was resting on the sleek glass-topped patio table a few feet away. The screen illuminated the darkness, flashing with an incoming notification. I walked over slowly, my heels making no sound against the outdoor decking. I glanced down at the glowing screen. It was a text message from a number I had not yet bothered to delete from my contacts. Jamal. Even from a distance, I could read the frantic, pathetic preview of the message illuminating the lock screen. It was a wall of desperate text. Maya, please. I am begging you on my hands and knees. I cannot live like this. The apartment building is awful. The noise never stops, and my mother is calling me every single hour, crying because she is sleeping in a motel. I know I ruined everything. I know I lied to you. But if you could just talk to me for 5 minutes, I swear to God, I can make it right. I miss my wife. I miss my life. Please just answer the phone. I stood there reading the words of a man who was drowning in the exact ocean he had tried to push me into. A month ago, reading a message like that might have sparked a sliver of guilt. It might have triggered that deeply ingrained instinct to fix things, to be the strong, accommodating woman who swoops in to rescue the men around her. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual anger burning in my chest. There was no lingering sorrow for the death of my marriage, and there was certainly no desire to gloat or seek further revenge. I realized in that quiet moment that the opposite of love is not hate. It is total, profound, unwavering indifference. He was just a stranger sending messages from a reality that no longer concerned me. I reached out, picked up the phone, and unlocked the screen. I did not open the message to read the rest of his pathetic, rambling apologies. I did not type out a scathing reply to remind him that his current misery was entirely the result of his own arrogance and greed. I simply tapped the contact information, scrolled down to the very bottom of the screen, and pressed the option to block the caller. A small confirmation prompt popped up asking if I was sure I wanted to stop receiving calls and messages from this contact. I tapped confirm without a single second of hesitation. I tossed the phone casually onto the plush cushions of the outdoor sofa. It landed with a soft, muted thud, immediately going dark and silencing the very last ghost of the Sterling family. They were no longer my problem. They were officially relegated to being a cautionary tale, a minor temporary footnote in the grand sweeping narrative of my success. I stepped back over to the edge of the balcony, lifting the crystal glass to my lips. I took a long, satisfying sip of the red wine. The taste was rich, complex, and incredibly rewarding. I looked back out over the sprawling, glowing grid of the Atlanta skyline. The city was alive, pulsing with opportunity and wealth, and I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of it all. I had defended my territory. I had protected my peace. I was completely unbothered, utterly untouchable, and for the first time in a very long time, I was entirely beautifully free. The core lesson from this story is that your hard-earned success should never be used as a bargaining chip to buy respect. Toxic people will often weaponize your empathy, manipulating you into shrinking yourself to protect their fragile egos. This journey teaches us that true power lies in financial independence and setting unshakable boundaries. You cannot heal a dysfunctional dynamic by funding someone else's delusions. Instead of playing small to fit into a broken system, you must have the courage to walk away, protect your peace, and unapologetically claim the empire you built with your own 2 hands. Share your empowerment story in the comments below, and let us know how you fiercely protected your peace from toxic people.